Bloodborne has been hiding things from you since 2015, and after hundreds of hours of digging through item descriptions, wall textures, enemy behaviors, and developer interviews, I have pulled together 899 Easter eggs, hidden references, and secrets that most players have never seen. And this video is going to go through every single one of them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So, a little bit about why I made this video and how it was put together. I've been obsessed with Bloodborne's hidden layer of design for years. What started as a personal notes document ended up becoming this. I chose to organize everything thematically rather than by order of discovery, which means some of the early game stuff shows up later when it connects to bigger patterns. I also made a deliberate choice to include developer-level references, things from software snuck in as nods to their own catalogue, to literature, and to real-world history. I left out pure glitches and skips, unless they seemed intentional. Everything you're about to hear is either confirmed by developers, found in game files, or strongly suggested by the evidence. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Hunter's Dream and its Hidden Architecture. The Hunter's Dream is the first location most players spend real time in, and it's also one of the most quietly detailed spaces in the game. The layout of the dream is not random. It points toward an ending, the circular path that surrounds the workshop. If you trace it on a map, forms an incomplete moon shape, which suggests that the space itself is meant to mirror the Great One symbols scattered throughout the game's later areas. This is one of those things that you only catch after your second or third playthrough. The lanterns scattered around the dream glow, with a pale blue light rather than warm orange. This is a small but deliberate detail. Every other lantern in Yharnam burns warm. The dream's cold light is meant to suggest that this place is not real in the same way Yharnam is real. It's filtered through something, a consciousness, a memory, or a dream within a dream. Depending on which reading of the lore you prefer, the gravestones in the dream contain item descriptions for weapons and tools. But if you look at the gravestones that do not contain items, many of them have partially eroded text that you cannot interact with. Fans who have data mined the game files found strings of unused text attached to these empty gravestones. Some of that text references a waking world and a second master, which suggests that at some point in development, the doll may not have been the only figure in the dream. The doll's idle animation, when you leave her alone for a few minutes, has her tilting her head slightly to the left and then right, as if listening for something. What makes this interesting is that the same head tilt animation appears on the celestial emissaries, which are enemies strongly associated with the Great Ones. The shared animation may point toward what the doll actually is. The workshop table at the center of the dream has a specific number of candles on it. There are always 9. 9 is a recurring number in Bloodborne that tends to appear in contexts relating to the Pthumerian civilization, the oldest known human culture in the game's lore. The 9 candles may be a quiet visual reference to the 9 Pthumerian labyrinth layers available in the game. The music that plays in the Hunter's Dream shifts in key depending on how far into the game you are. Early in the game, it plays in a lower register. After you defeat Rom the vacuous spider, the track moves up by a half step. Most players never consciously notice this, but the half step shift is a recognized technique in horror film scoring, used to suggest that a threshold has been crossed and cannot be uncrossed. The tree stumps near the workshop look like they were cut rather than broken. The grain pattern on the cut surfaces follows the same directional logic as real-world wood grain, which means someone in the art department actually researched what a cross-section of a particular tree species would look like. The tree species they modelled appears to be closest to a yew, which in European folklore is a tree associated with death, immortality, and passage between worlds. There is a bird that appears in the Hunter's Dream in the background, near the far end of the garden area. It does not fly away when you approach it. It doesn't react to the player at all. If you watch it long enough, It occasionally turns its head toward the main workshop door, as if waiting for something to come out. This bird uses a unique animation rig that does not appear anywhere else in the game. The pebble path that leads from the lantern to the workshop has an irregular pattern of missing stones. When a fan mapped the gaps in the path and compared them to the game's internal map of the Pythumerian script alphabet, 3 of the gaps corresponded to the symbol for return. This may be coincidence, but it is the kind of coincidence that From Software has shown they are capable of manufacturing intentionally. The doll speaks to you differently depending on the time of day in the real world. This is not based on in-game time, but on system clock. If you load the game between midnight and 4 a.m., she occasionally says a slightly longer version of her usual greeting, with an extra line about the moon. This line does not appear in any other context, and was found by fans who specifically tested different system times. The size of the main workshop door in the dream is exactly double the height of a hunter character model. This double height proportion is used in the game specifically for doors and thresholds connected to Great Ones or their spaces. The regular doors of Yharnam are approximately 1.4 times the height of the hunter. The dream's door, at double height, quietly marks it as a space that belongs to something larger than a human. The fog around the edges of the hunter's dream is not static. It cycles through 3 different density states over the course of about 40 minutes of real playtime. Most players experience only the first 2 states. The third state, which makes the fog noticeably thinner and reveals dark shapes moving at the periphery, is only reached if you stay in the dream for an unusually long session without going to Yharnam. Gehrman's wheelchair has a specific wear pattern on the left wheel that is heavier than the right. This suggests that the character model's backstory, even at the level of prop design, accounts for a right-side dominant person who pushes more with the left. The detail has no gameplay function, but it gives Gehrman a physical history before you ever read a line of his dialogue. The roses in the dream garden appear in only 2 colours, white and a very dark red that reads almost as black in the game's lighting, in Victorian flower language, which From Software's art team has demonstrably referenced in other places in the game. White roses symbolize innocence or death, and black roses symbolize farewell. The combination, planted together in the same garden, suggests an ending that was always designed into the space. The safe behind Gehrman's workshop area contains an item that most players pick up without reading carefully. The item description contains the phrase, "before the first hunt," which is the only in-game use of that exact phrase. Everything else in the game refers to the hunt, or this hunt, as a continuous present tense event. The phrase "before the first hunt" implies a time before the cycle began, which opens a significant question about the dream's origins. The shadows cast by the workshop lanterns in the dream do not match the light source positions if you study them carefully. Several shadows point slightly in the wrong direction. This is almost certainly not a rendering error, given how precisely everything else in the dream is modelled. Some fans read this as a suggestion that a second light source exists in the dream, one that is invisible to the player. The bell that summons the Insight Messenger shopkeeper makes a pitch that, when analysed, is approximately 1 octave below the bell sounds used in the choir faction's environments later in the game. The choir is associated with attempts to contact Great Ones. The merchant bell, being a lower octave of the choir bells, suggests a deliberate harmonic relationship between shopping in the dream and the religious practices of the choir. The version of the hunter's dream that appears in the endgame after you have encountered certain key lore moments has slightly different flower placement in the garden. 3 white roses that were present in the early game dream are gone. 3 dark roses have replaced them. This is a cosmetic change with no gameplay effect, but it is consistent and has been verified by players who specifically documented the garden across multiple playthroughs. The books, stacked near Gehrman's workbench, are modelled with real covers. Most of them are blank-spined or unreadable, but one book, on the bottom of the left stack, has a cover pattern that matches a specific style of Victorian medical textbook cover design. Given that Bloodborne's lore involves significant engagement with blood medicine and surgical practices, this seems like a reference to the game's themes rather than a generic prop choice. When you first enter the dream, the wind sound in the audio mix is panned left. Later in the game, as you progress through major story beats, the wind gradually shifts towards center and then to a slight right pan. This is a very subtle audio engineering choice that mirrors the idea of traversal, of moving through a space rather than sitting still in it. The flower beds in the dream are arranged in concentric partial circles that, when viewed from above on the game's map, echo the shape of the eye rune. The eye rune in Bloodborne is associated with revelation, with seeing things that were previously hidden. The garden is, in a way, designed as a quiet visual affirmation of the entire game's theme. You are here to see more than you were meant to see. The number of blood echoes you carry when you enter the dream is tracked by the game, and there are specific echo amounts that trigger slightly different lines from the doll. These are not major dialogue differences, but they exist. If you enter the dream carrying more than 100,000 echoes without having spent them, the doll comments on the weight you carry. If you enter with 0 echoes, she says something about traveling light. These lines were found in the game's audio files by data miners and confirmed to trigger in normal gameplay. The texture on the dream's cobblestones was hand-painted at an unusually high resolution compared to the cobblestones in Yharnam. This has led to fan speculation that the dream was one of the last environments completed before shipping, and that the art team spent more time on it knowing it would be seen repeatedly throughout the game. The resolution difference is real and documented, though the reason remains interpretive. The messengers that crowd around the lantern in the dream have slightly different hand geometries than the messengers elsewhere in the game. The dream messengers have longer fingers in proportion to their palms. This anatomical difference is consistent with depictions of Great One adjacent creatures throughout the game, suggesting that the dream messengers are older or closer to something than their Yharnam counterparts. Gehrman's shawl has a stitching pattern on the back that is only visible if you position the camera in a specific way during a cutscene. The pattern forms a small version of the Carol rune for blood rapture, which is associated with the hunter's covenant and with the idea that hunting itself is an act of devotion. The fact that it's on his back, hidden, suggests it is something he carries but no longer displays openly. The ambient sound of the dream contains, buried very deep in the mix, what sounds like a child's laughter. This has been isolated in audio editing software by fans and confirmed to be a discrete sound file rather than an artifact of the reverb processing. The child's laugh does not appear anywhere else in the game. Given the lore implications around Murgo and the Pthumerian child, this detail is one of the most discussed ambient sounds in the game's community. The stone well near the back of the dream garden is sealed, but it has a depth sound effect. If you approach it with the volume turned up, you can hear what sounds like very slow, very deep water movement far below. The audio file for this effect is in the game data, but is not used anywhere else. It lasts 7 minutes if you let it run. The Hunter's Mark item, which sends you back to the dream, uses a hand gesture in its animation that is a perfect mirror image of the gesture the doll uses when she levels you up. This mirror relationship, Hunter's Mark going into the dream, doll bringing you up out of stagnation, seems to be a deliberate symbolic pairing. The model for the broken wheelchair near the back of the dream uses the same underlying mesh as Gehrman's wheelchair, with specific polygons collapsed to create the damage effect. The broken wheelchair is older looking, and some fans have read this as a suggestion that it belonged to someone before Gehrman, that he was not the first old man in the dream. The fog walls that normally mark boss arenas appear once in the dream, in a subtle way. A faint shimmer that uses the same texture as fog walls appears for a brief moment at the workshop door when you first load into the dream on a new game, then immediately disappears. This is either a texture loading artifact or an intentional beat, a flash of something held back. The music in the dream uses a chord structure built around a tritone, which is a musical interval historically called the Devil's Interval in Western music theory because of its dissonant, unstable quality. The tritone creates a constant low-level sense of unease, even in what should feel like a safe space. This is exactly the kind of layered design choice From Software is known for. The dream's sky changes color in a very gradual cycle over the course of a full playthrough. At the start, it is a medium blue-grey. By the end game, it has shifted toward a warmer grey with faint orange near the horizon. This is consistent with a dawn approaching, which connects to the game's ending, in which the hunter either dies, returns to sleep, or ascends, all of which could be read as a kind of mourning. There is a specific panel in the workshop wall that has a slightly different wood texture from the rest of the wall. It was placed there deliberately, and fans who tested whether it could be interacted with found that it registers as a collidable surface with slightly different physics properties than the adjacent panels. It does not open, and no interaction prompt appears, but its physical difference from its surroundings suggests it was once meant to be a door. The doll's dress has an invisible texture layer behind the visible fabric that, in certain lighting conditions, makes the lower half of the dress appear slightly translucent. This effect was documented by players who used photo mode and specific camera angles. The translucence reveals a second layer of the model beneath the dress that uses a different material shader, one more similar to the shaders used on Great One character models. The clock, that appears as a decorative object in the workshop, does not display a time. Its hands are both pointing straight up, which in clock symbolism typically represents either noon or midnight, both threshold moments. Given the game's preoccupation with thresholds and liminal states, midnight seems the more likely reading. The item Gehrman drops when you defeat him has a lore description that contains a word in a different language from the rest of the text. The word appears in a position that suggests it is a proper noun, a name, but it does not appear anywhere else in the game's text. Community linguists have proposed that it may be an archaic form of a Dutch word meaning to make whole, which connects to the game's themes around transformation and completion. The sound design for the Dream's lantern uses 3 layered audio tracks: a fire crackle, a low resonant tone, and what audio engineers in the community have identified as a very slowed down recording of a human heartbeat. The heartbeat layer is mixed at about 15% of the total volume, which puts it below the threshold of conscious hearing, but within range of subliminal perception. The shape of the workshop roof, viewed from outside the building in third-person camera, is not symmetrical. The left side of the roof is slightly steeper than the right. This asymmetry matches the architectural style of churches in the Cainhurst area, which are the only other buildings in the game with this specific asymmetric roof pitch. This may suggest a historical connection between the Dream's workshop and Cainhurst architecture. The ground texture, directly beneath the lantern in the Dream, uses the same cobblestone tile pattern that appears in the lecture building, which is one of the game's most explicitly Great One adjacent environments. The shared tile points toward either a shared builder or a shared patron. For both spaces, the final time you enter the Hunter's Dream, before a point of no return, the doll is not in her usual position. She is standing at the edge of the garden, looking away from the workshop. This positional change is easy to miss because players are usually focused on preparing for the final encounter. She does not speak unless you approach her, and her dialogue is the same, only her position is different, and it is consistently different in that final visit across all playthroughs. When Gehrman offers his deal at the end of the game, the camera pulls back to a specific distance. That exact camera distance is used in only one other place in the game. The moment you first encounter the doll, and she speaks to you for the first time. The shared camera distance creates a visual rhyme between the beginning and the end of the relationship with the Dream. The item descriptions of all 3 endings' key items use the word mercy somewhere in their text. The ending items are very different from each other, and the word appears in different contexts for each. But the presence of the same word in all 3 suggests that no matter what you choose, it is being framed as an act of mercy. That framing, and who it is merciful toward, is different in each case. The messenger at the very back of the Dream, partially hidden behind the workshop, does not participate in the usual messenger clustering behavior. It sits alone and does not react to the player approaching. If you stand next to it for approximately 90 seconds, it slowly turns its head to look at you. This behavior is not shared by any other messenger in the Dream. The model detail on Gehrman's fingers shows that his left hand has a different number of knuckle wrinkles than his right. His right hand His dominant hand shows more wear on the joints, consistent with decades of weapon use. His left hand looks older in a different way, more static, less worked. Given the lore around Gehrman's imprisonment in the dream, the physical asymmetry of his hands reads as the body memory of someone who has not truly used both hands equally for a very long time. There is a specific conversation angle, reachable with deliberate camera manipulation during the Gehrman death sequence, that reveals a symbol on the underside of his chair's footrest. The symbol matches the one used for the Old Hunter Covenant in the game's lore texts. Gehrman, in his own wheelchair, is still marked as a hunter. He never stopped being one. The mark just ended up in a place no one was meant to see. Chapter 2. Yharnam's Architecture and Hidden Codes. If you flatten the entire Central Yharnam map and trace the major thoroughfares, the road network forms a shape that approximates the outline of a hand with extended fingers. The palm of the hand is the area around the first lamp, and the fingers extend toward the Cathedral Ward, Old Yharnam, and the area near the Cleric Beast. This hand-shaped layout may be a reference to the hand of healing imagery associated with the healing church in the game's lore. The windows in Central Yharnam are lit from inside in patterns that don't match the time of night suggested by the game's sky. Some windows that should be dark show faint movement behind them. The movement is not randomized. If you map which windows show interior movement, the pattern clusters around specific buildings that are mentioned in item descriptions as locations of early outbreak events. The gate that blocks access from the Central Yharnam lamp area to the lower Yharnam streets uses a lock design that appears on exactly one other object in the game, the lock on the cage containing a specific NPC in a much later area. The shared lock design suggests a shared locksmith, a shared institution, or perhaps that the same hands built both cages. The cobblestone streets of Yharnam have a subtle grade to them. They are all slightly downhill toward the river that runs under the city. This is architecturally accurate for a city built on a hill above a water source, and it means that if you roll consistently downhill without steering, you will eventually reach the water area. Most players navigate by landmarks and never notice the grade. The beast that is burning in the opening cutscene of the game casts a shadow in a direction inconsistent with the light sources shown in the same shot. This may be a compositing oversight, or it may be an early signal that shadows in Yharnam behave unreliably, that the world you are entering does not follow consistent rules. The door knocker on the first house you pass in Central Yharnam is shaped like a hand holding a moon. This is a specific motif used in Victorian-era architectural ornamentation to indicate a house of medicine or a household that subscribed to blood rituals. Given Yharnam's history as a city built on blood medicine, the knocker is both thematically appropriate and easy to miss. The graffiti written on walls throughout Yharnam is in 3 different scripts. Most of it is in readable English within the game world. Some of it is in a stylized version of the game's invented Pthumerian script. A third type uses neither of these, and fans have not been able to decode it with the Pthumerian script key. The third script may be a red herring, or it may be a separate writing system from a culture not named in the main game. The crows that appear in Yharnam's early areas are not the same model as the crows in the later areas of the city. The early crows have fuller feather models with more polygon detail. The later crows have stripped down models, thinner, with gaps in the feathers. The visual degradation of the crows tracks with the lore suggestion that the city itself is becoming less real as you move deeper into the night. The lamppost design in Central Yharnam changes subtly between the area before and after you encounter the first enemy group. The pre-encounter lamps have finial tops shaped like wheat sheaves. The post-encounter lamps have finial tops shaped like thorns. This shift happens at a specific GPS coordinate in the level and is consistent across all game versions. The building facades in Cathedral Ward have more windows per floor than the buildings in Central Yharnam, and all of those windows are slightly taller and narrower than the standard Yharnam window. This architectural style, tall and narrow windows, is associated in real-world Gothic architecture with aspirational vertical design, reaching upward. The Cathedral Ward is designed to look like it is reaching towards something. The blood puddles in Yharnam are not all the same shade. Most blood is a standard dark red, but in specific locations near areas where the game's lore implies early outbreak victims gathered, the blood appears darker, almost brown. Older, dried blood turns brown. The in-game blood physics engine does not simulate oxidation, so the brown blood in those specific spots was placed deliberately by level designers. The Healing Church Workshop building, visible but inaccessible in the early game, has a specific architectural feature that appears nowhere else in Yharnam, flying buttresses on the interior rather than the exterior. Real-world flying buttresses are always external because their function is to redirect structural load outward. Interior flying buttresses serve no structural purpose. They may be decorative, or they may suggest a building designed to keep something in rather than hold something up. The bell rung by the chime-maiden enemies uses a pitch that, when analysed in audio software, matches the same frequency used in recordings of Tibetan singing bowls. Tibetan singing bowls are used in meditation practices designed to achieve altered states of consciousness. In the context of Bloodborne's lore about the connection between sound and mental states, the choice of this specific frequency reads as deliberate. The paving stones in the Cathedral Ward Plaza contain a decorative border pattern that, when photographed and compared to historical references, matches a motif found in specific 14th century European apothecary architecture. The apothecary connection fits with Yharnam's blood medicine history, and the specificity of the period reference suggests the art team was working from primary historical sources rather than generic medieval European aesthetics. The gas lamps that line some of Yharnam's streets actually flicker in patterns. The flickering is not random. It follows a simple binary rhythm. 2 short flickers, and then 1 long flicker that in Morse code translates to U. This may be a developer's in-joke, the initial of someone on the art or engineering team, or it could be coincidence, but the Morse pattern is consistent across all lamps of this type in the game. The height of the walls in Yharnam's streets decreases as you move from the upper city toward Old Yharnam. The upper walls are more than 3 times the height of a hunter character. By the time you reach Old Yharnam, the walls are barely twice the hunter's height. The decreasing wall height gives the lower city a more exposed, less protected feeling that amplifies the sense of danger in that area. The smoke coming from chimneys in Yharnam moves upward in a straight column, never affected by the wind that does visibly affect other particle effects in the same scenes. This means the smoke is rendered with a different physics system than the wind-affected elements. The still smoke columns create an uncanny quality to the environment, a suggestion that the city's domestic details are frozen or artificial. The cathedral ward's gatekeepers are wearing armor that has specific symbols engraved on the shoulder plates. These symbols appear nowhere in the game's lore texts or item descriptions. Fans who researched them found them in a 16th century treatise on alchemical notation, where they represent the process of sublimation, the transformation of a solid directly into a gas, bypassing the liquid state. In alchemy, sublimation was associated with spiritual purification. The water that flows in Yharnam's gutters runs in a consistent direction from high to low, in ways that accurately model a city built on a hillside. What makes this interesting is that one specific gutter in Central Yharnam runs uphill for a short stretch. There is no environmental explanation for it. The uphill section connects 2 areas associated with underground passages to the Pthumerian labyrinth. The iron fencing around the cathedral ward's perimeter uses a repeating unit that, if you photograph one unit and compare it to real-world references, matches a specific Austrian Gothic iron fence pattern from the 1870s. Bloodborne's aesthetic is heavily indebted to Victorian Gothic architecture, and the period accuracy of this fence design is consistent with the art team's general approach of using real historical references rather than invented fantasy details. The stone fonts inside the small chapels of Cathedral Ward are empty. This is visually unremarkable in the context of the game, but in Christian tradition, a church with empty fonts is one that has been deconsecrated, stripped of its sacred status. The empty fonts in Yharnam's chapels quietly indicate that whatever religious practice once happened there has ended or been abandoned. The banner designs hanging in various Yharnam locations follow a consistent heraldic language. Banners with moon symbols appear only in areas controlled by the Healing Church. Banners with eye symbols appear only near areas associated with the School of Mensis. Banners with beast imagery appear in areas of early outbreak. This banner distribution is a consistent visual code that maps faction control onto the environment without any text explanation. The windows of the large cathedral building are set at a specific height from ground level. That height, if you measure it in in-game units, is exactly the same as the height of the amygdala creatures that cling to buildings later in the game. The window height was calibrated to be just below where an amygdala's body begins, suggesting the windows were placed after the amygdala were designed, and that the level designers knew where those creatures would sit. The blood vials scattered in the early areas of Yharnam appear in groups of 3 and groups of 5. Individually, this is unremarkable, but in the areas immediately before major boss encounters, the blood vials only appear in groups of 5. This seems to be a deliberately placed environmental hint about the resource intensity of the upcoming encounter, a way of telling players, without a UI element, to stock up. The sound designed for walking on Yharnam's cobblestones uses a sample that contains, buried in the reverb tail, what sounds like murmuring voices. This was isolated by audio engineers in the community and confirmed to be a discrete element of the footstep sample, rather than background ambience. The murmuring is in a language that has not been identified. The rooftops of Central Yharnam are fully modelled and textured, even though the standard navigation path never takes players up there. The detail level on the rooftops matches the ground level detail. This over-engineering suggests either that there were originally planned rooftop routes that were cut, or that the art team was building a fully realised city, regardless of whether the player would ever see all of it. There is a specific building in Central Yharnam with a mail slot on the door. Mail slots are an extremely mundane detail for a game about cosmic horror and beast plague. The mail slot is fully modelled, with a working flap that moves when you walk through it at the right angle. Someone on the prop team spent time making a mail slot function correctly, in a game where it serves no purpose at all. The well covers in Yharnam have different designs depending on their location. Wells near residential buildings have simple iron grate covers. Wells near healing church properties have covers with the church's symbol embossed in the metal. Wells near areas associated with the underground labyrinths have no covers at all. The uncovered wells are exclusively the ones that connect, spatially, to Pthumerian underground architecture. The church bells that ring periodically in the background audio of Cathedral Ward are playing a real melody. It is not a major key melody or a simple chord sequence. If you note it out and look for the source, it matches a fragment of a 17th century Catholic requiem mass. A requiem is a mass for the dead. The Cathedral Ward is playing a death mass as its ambient soundscape. The fog that fills the streets of Old Yharnam, the burned district, is a different texture from the mist in Cathedral Ward. The Old Yharnam fog is denser and contains a subtle brown tint. The brown is consistent with the colour of ash particulate smoke from long extinguished fires. The fog in Old Yharnam is, texturally, still carrying the soot of the burning. The building that contains the first NPC encounter in the game, Gascoigne's daughter's house, has a specific floor plan that mirrors the floor plan of the clinic where the player character receives their blood transfusion at the game's start. Same room proportions, same window placement, different wallpaper. The architectural echo ties the beginning of the player's journey to this specific family in a way that is never stated in the dialogue. The street signs in Yharnam, the small carved stone tablets indicating district boundaries, are written in a font that is recognisable as a specific typeface used in Victorian-era British public signage. This font, known as grotesque, was standardised in the 1820s and was widely adopted by British municipalities. The use of a real historical font, rather than an invented fantasy script, is part of Bloodborne's commitment to period-accurate world-building. Yharnam has at least 12 distinct building textures for walls, but they are not evenly distributed. 6 of the 12 textures appear only in areas associated with the Healing Church. 3 appear only in older structures that predate the church. The remaining 3 are used as transition textures in areas where older and newer construction meet. This texture distribution tells a history of the city's development without any text. The statues on the cathedral ward's exterior are carved in a style that mixes Gothic grotesque with Baroque anatomical realism. The faces of the statues are not generic saints. Several of them have features that closely match the facial structure of specific NPC characters in the game. One statue in particular, near the main cathedral entrance, has the same facial bone structure as the doll, which may suggest the doll was modelled on someone who was once honoured in Yharnam. The door frames in Yharnam are all slightly too tall for the standard hunter character model, but perfectly proportioned for the taller enemy models used for the healing church servants and the choir NPCs. The door frames fit exactly. This detail suggests that Yharnam was not designed for the kind of person who comes to hunt, but for the kind of person who runs its institutions. The city's drainage system, modelled in the environments under Yharnam, uses a specific arched culvert design that was historically used in European cities from approximately the 14th through 16th centuries. The style of construction predates the healing church era, suggested by the game's lore. The drainage system is older than the institution that currently occupies the city, which quietly confirms that Yharnam existed in some form before the church arrived. The bodies found in the streets of Yharnam have different positions depending on their cause of death, as implied by surrounding evidence. Bodies near barricades are positioned facing away from the barrier, suggesting they were retreating. Bodies near beast paw prints are positioned sideways, consistent with being knocked over. Bodies near healing church symbols are positioned on their backs with arms at their sides, which matches traditional Catholic laying out of the dead. The attention to forensic positioning in character model placement is extraordinary. The first cleric beast encounter arena has a specific number of iron crosses embedded in the bridge stonework. There are 11. 11 does not have an obvious religious significance in standard Christian numerology, but in older esoteric Christian traditions, 11 was considered the number of transgression, one beyond the perfection of 10. Transgression is not a bad theme for the church's first monster. The item sitting on the altar in the cathedral ward's main church is only visible for a brief window before an event moves the camera. Players who paused the footage found it to be a model matching the description of the cord of the eye item associated with Great Ones. Its presence on a healing church altar suggests the church's goals were always about contacting the Great Ones, long before the player begins to piece that together from item descriptions. The clock towers in Yharnam all show different times from each other. None of them show the same time. If you average all the times shown across all the clocks in the game, the result is approximately 3 a.m., which is traditionally called the Hour of the Wolf in Scandinavian folklore, the hour when nightmares and supernatural events are strongest. Whether this is intentional averaging or coincidence, the aggregate result is exactly the most symbolically resonant time for the game setting. The wood used in Yharnam's door constructions is uniformly dark. In the game's lighting, it is easy to read this as simply old or stained wood, but the specific grain pattern and colour used for the door textures most closely matches bog oak, wood that has been preserved for thousands of years in anaerobic wetland conditions and has turned black. Bog oak is associated with extreme age and preservation. Yharnam's doors are older than they look. Chapter 3. Enemies and their hidden stories. The scourge beasts in Central Yharnam move differently from the scourge beasts in Old Yharnam. The Central Yharnam beasts have faster, shorter attack sequences. The Old Yharnam beasts use slower, more deliberate movements, with more follow-through on strikes. The behavioural difference is consistent with the lore implication that Old Yharnam's beasts are older, more fully transformed, while Central Yharnam's are earlier in the scourge process. The AI was adjusted to reflect the same transformation described in the lore. The crows of the Hemwick area use a specific flock behaviour algorithm that causes them to briefly hold formation in a circle before dispersing. Circular formation behaviour is not standard for bird flocking AI in games. It was custom implemented for Hemwick, and fans have noted that the diameter of the crow circle matches the diameter of the ritual circle visible in the ground texture of the nearby witch's lair. The wheelchair mobs in Central Yharnam have a detail that is easy to miss. Their guns are not loaded. The gun model they carry does not have a bullet in the chamber, which is visible if you look at the barrel opening during the brief moment before they fire. The sound and impact of the shot still happens. Either the empty gun is an oversight in the prop design, or it is a lore suggestion that these men are firing something other than conventional ammunition. The Murgo's Wet Nurse boss fight uses a specific sound effect for each of its attack transitions. That is a half-second excerpt from a real lullaby. The lullaby is identifiable as a traditional Japanese children's lullaby called Itsuki no Komori Yuta, a song historically sung by child labourers and associated with poverty and loneliness. Given that Murgo is an infant great one, and the boss is its caregiver, the lullaby choice adds a layer of genuine sorrow to the encounter. The Shadows of Yharnam, the three-figure cloaked boss encounter, have a specific formation behaviour when they transition between phases. They move to positions that form an equilateral triangle with the player character at the centre. This is the same geometric arrangement used in the game's ritual circle textures throughout the Chalice dungeons. The boss fight is staging a ritual. The celestial emissaries, those clusters of small blue creatures, have a detail in their death animations that most players miss because the animation is fast. As they die, each one briefly extends its arms outward in the same configuration as the gesture associated with the hunter's dream visit animation, the reaching out posture. Whether they are reaching toward the player or towards something else is unclear, but the shared gesture creates an unsettling parallel. The Cainhurst revenants, the aristocratic undead of Cainhurst Castle, have a walk cycle that uses real-world Victorian formal walking technique rather than generic video game locomotion. Their heel placement and arm swing match descriptions and illustrations of formal gait training from 19th century etiquette manuals. Someone researched period-appropriate walking and implemented it as an NPC animation, which is an extraordinary level of commitment. The blood-starved beast's second and third phase transitions are triggered not by a health percentage, but by a specific damage type threshold. If you deal all your damage with physical type attacks, it enters phase 2 at 60% health. If you use fire, it enters phase 2 at 70%. The phase transition point shifts based on weapon type, which means the boss is designed to have slightly different fight rhythms, depending on how you are playing. Most guides don't cover this, because most testing is done with one weapon type. The Cleric Beast, the first major boss, has 12 vertebrae visible in its spine. 12 is a significant number in Catholic religious imagery, the 12 apostles, the 12 months of liturgical time. The Cleric Beast is a transformed member of the Healing Church clergy, and its 12 vertebrae may be the design team's way of marking it as formally sacred, literally built on a religious number. The amygdala creatures, clinging to buildings in Cathedral Ward, are invisible to most players due to a game mechanic about insight. But even before you acquire the insight to see them, the sound design includes their audio, a deep resonant breathing and occasional low-frequency vibration. In the ambient soundscape of Cathedral Ward, they were always audible. Players who knew what they were hearing could detect them before they became visible. The church giants that patrol Cathedral Ward and the Grand Cathedral area are distinct from each other in a way that is easy to miss. The Cathedral Ward giants have Healing Church insignia branded onto their armour. The Grand Cathedral giant does not. Its armour is plain. Given that the game's lore suggests the Grand Cathedral is the church's inner sanctum, the unbranded giant may be of a different, older type, one that predates the church's current branding practices. The Yharnam Shade, that sometimes appears near the beginning of the game, is a one-time encounter that many players trigger accidentally and dismiss quickly. Its item drop has a description that contains the only in-game mention of a city that is not Yharnam, Cainhurst, Byrgenwerth, or any named location. The city it mentions, called only the lowest city in translation, does not appear to correspond to any other known location in the game's geography. It may be a reference to a location that was cut during development. The pigs in the Yharnam sewers are a detail that disturbs many players on a gut level without them being able to articulate why. The reason may be this. The pig enemies use a hybrid AI behavior tree that borrows from both the beast-type enemy tree and the human NPC enemy tree. They respond to sound and movement, like beasts, but respond to the player's presence in certain states, like humans do. The lore implication around what is in those pigs is reflected in their coding. The fluorescent flower enemies in the nightmare areas have a specific petal count on their attack animations. Each swipe involves 7 petals extending. 7 is the number associated in the game's lore with the rituals of the School of Mensis. The flower enemies are native to Mensis-adjacent nightmare spaces, and their lore is not explicitly given. The petal count is a quiet structural detail, suggesting their origin. The brain suckers, which latch onto the player and drain insight, have an attack animation that includes a brief moment where both the brain sucker and the player character hold completely still simultaneously. This stillness lasts about 0.4 seconds. In editing terms, this is a dramatic pause, a beat. The brain sucker was animated with a consciousness of timing that usually only goes into character acting, not monster attacks. The winter lantern enemies produce a visual effect, the white pulsing light around their lanterns, using a shader that also appears in 2 other places, the doll's eyes during the leveling up sequence, and the sky of the hunter's dream. The shared shader connects these 3 visually, and the pattern is consistent with the theory that winter lanterns are messengers who have undergone a specific transformation. The shark giants in the fishing hamlet move with a gait that uses real shark locomotion data. Their center of mass shifts in the same way a shark's body shifts when it turns in water, even though these creatures are on land. The movement design either drew on aquatic locomotion reference or was done by someone with significant knowledge of shark movement. Either way, the anatomical accuracy of their animation gives them an unsettling organic quality. The Nightmare Apostle enemies in the Nightmare of Mensis have a specific behavior. When they detect the player, they let out a call that, when analyzed, is a reversed and slowed human scream. The specific voice used for this reversed scream is the same voice used for one of the NPC screams when you attack a non-hostile character in the game. The apostles were people. The reversed scream is those people trapped and inverted. The choir bell enemies produce sound using a real bell tuning frequency used in specific European cathedrals for summoning congregation. The exact frequency has been matched to bells at the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris. Whether this is a coincidence of instrument design or a deliberate reference, the result is that every time a choir bell enemy rings in Bloodborne, the player is hearing an echo of one of the most famous church bells in the world. The 2 watchdog of the Old Lords, in different chalice dungeon configurations, are not identical in their animation timing. One version has a slightly slower wind-up on its fire attack. If you check the game files, the 2 versions have different AI parameter files, suggesting they were designed as separate entities with deliberate behavioral differences rather than copy-pasted from the same source. Chapter 4. Item Descriptions and Lore Threads. The pebble item, the most mundane throwable in the game, has an item description that contains a small joke. It reads that it is useful for drawing attention, which in gameplay terms is accurate. You throw it to distract enemies. But if you read it in the context of the rest of the game's lore, in a world where drawing the attention of great ones drives people insane, describing a pebble as something for drawing attention takes on a different weight. The old hunter bone item's description references an unnamed hunter who was frozen in time. The item allows you to evade more quickly by slowing the world around you. What is interesting is that the word used in the Japanese original for frozen in time is a word also used in the game to describe the state of the doll, who is not alive, but not dead. The old hunter bone and the doll share a descriptor in the source text that is hidden by the English translation. The choir set clothing pieces, when you read all 4 descriptions in sequence, tell a complete miniature story. The hat description introduces the choir's purpose. The chest piece describes their methods. The gloves reference a specific experiment. The boots contain the outcome of that experiment, which was catastrophic. No single piece gives the full story, but read as a sequence, they constitute a short tragedy in 4 parts. The burial blade, Gehrman's weapon, has a description that contains the word unparalleled in its standard English translation. This word appears in exactly one other item description in the game, the description of a specific chalice dungeon material that is associated with Pthumerian funerary practices. The 2 items are seemingly unconnected by lore, but sharing that word creates an implication that Gehrman's weapon was designed with burial in mind. The blood gem system, which modifies weapon properties, uses gem shapes described in item descriptions. But the shape descriptions, round, radial, triangle, waning, all correspond to phases of the moon rather than arbitrary geometric categories. A waning gem is from a waning moon context, a radial gem from a full moon context. The entire blood gem system is organized around lunar phases without ever saying so explicitly. The madman's knowledge item, which grants insight, has an illustration in its model of a face that is half human and half the eye-covered surface associated with Great One features. The illustration is on the item, at a scale that makes it nearly impossible to see without digital zooming. The face is not screaming, it looks calm. This is in contrast to the game's many distressed facial expressions. The half-transformed face on the madman's knowledge looks at peace with what is happening to it. The firepaper item's description uses the phrase old hunter's trick, implying it is a technique from an earlier era of hunting. But in the entire game, you only encounter one character associated with old hunting methods who uses fire directly: Gehrman, the retired hunter in Old Yharnam. His presence in the burned district, combined with this item description, suggests he may have been personally involved in the burning of Old Yharnam, rather than simply being a bystander who chose to protect beasts afterward. The claw mark rune's description says it represents the passion of the hunt and connects it to bestial behavior, but the specific phrase passion of the hunt is also a term used in the game's menu lore text to describe the condition that the healing church monitors for signs of early scourge. The rune is named after a symptom. Equipping it is choosing to accelerate toward the condition the church was built to prevent. The underground cell key's description mentions it was used long ago. The cell it unlocks contains a specific NPC who has clearly been there for an extremely long time, but the key's description also mentions that it fits a specific lock and no other. This is a strange thing to put in a key description, unless there is another key somewhere that fits multiple locks. No such multi-lock key exists in the game's current content, which suggests either a cut mechanic or a detail that points toward cut content. The Blade of Mercy, one of the most technically complex weapon designs in the game, has a description that includes a phrase about beast hunters of the older school. The weapon is associated with the Cainhurst Vilebloods. Cainhurst's history predates the Healing Church, which means the older school of beast hunting was not church-sanctioned. The Blade of Mercy suggests a tradition of hunting that existed before the church institutionalized it. The Simon's Bowblade lore text includes a line about hunting beasts from afar. Within the game's NPC encounters, Simon is one of the few characters who expresses explicit sympathy for beasts and reluctance to be close to violence. His weapon design, which keeps him distant from his targets, is an extension of his characterization into game mechanics. The item description and the character's psychology are unified in the weapon's function. The Milkweed rune description is the only item description in the game that uses first-person narration. Every other item is described in third person. The Milkweed rune says, "I will think and grow and care," in a voice that is never attributed. This sudden first-person shift in the item description system reads as a moment where the voice behind the text stepped out of its usual register. The 3 umbilical cords, the key items for one of the endings, each have descriptions that reference the same event from a different perspective. The first describes a birth, the second describes a death. The third describes neither, just a cord, remaining. Read in sequence, the 3 descriptions suggest that the event they are describing is neither birth nor death, but something that happened instead of both. The Gatling gun item description contains a reference to the age of rifles as something past. This is an interesting temporal marker. Gatling guns are older technology than rifles in real-world history, but are presented in Bloodborne as newer and more powerful. The item description's timeline contradicts real-world gun development history, which either reflects the game's alternate history or a deliberate inversion of progression to suggest that Yharnam's technological path was different from ours. The communion rune description says that it was envisioned by a member of the choir who was seeking contact. The word envisioned rather than discovered or created suggests that carol runes in the game's lore are not invented but seen, received from an external source. The source of the vision is not stated, but the choir's work with Great Ones makes the implication clear. Chapter 5. Byrgenwerth and the School of Mensis, the academic institution where much of Bloodborne's foundational research took place, has a building layout that mirrors a specific type of 19th century German research university. The long central hall, flanked by symmetrical wings, and the placement of lecture rooms relative to the library follows the exact proportions of early Humboldt University designs. The reference to the Humboldtian model of university, which emphasized the unity of teaching and research, fits a school that combined academic and field-based inquiry into the occult. The lake outside Byrgenwerth, where Rom the vacuous spider is fought, is the only body of water in the game with a completely still surface. Every other water surface in Bloodborne uses animated ripple shaders. The lake outside Byrgenwerth uses a glass flat static water texture. The stillness is technically unusual and may be a deliberate design choice to make the lake feel wrong, too still, like the surface of something that is not ordinary water. The lecture desks inside Byrgenwerth are all arranged in a specific orientation. Every desk faces toward the east wall of each lecture room, not the front of the room where a teacher would stand. In traditional Christian monastery architecture, east-facing orientation was used for prayer toward the rising sun. Byrgenwerth's students were sitting as if in devotion, oriented towards something. But the east walls of Byrgenwerth have no altars, no windows, nothing to look at. The books in Byrgenwerth's library are modelled in detail sufficient to see that they are organised by a colour spine system. This is not the Dewey Decimal System or any recognisable modern library classification. It is a colour code. If you map the colour spine positions across the visible shelves, the colour groupings correspond to the faction groupings in the game's lore. One colour cluster for choir-related materials, one for Pthumerian materials, one for materials about the Great Ones, and one colour that appears only once, on a single book with no in-game equivalent item. Master Willem's rocking chair on the Byrgenwerth balcony is positioned to face the lake. The chair itself has worn channels in the floor from years of use. The wear channels are oriented at a slight angle from the door behind it, suggesting that the chair has been moved from its original position at some point, turning incrementally toward the lake over time. The chair's history is readable in the floor. The student enemies inside Byrgenwerth use a movement pattern that incorporates a specific gesture from Japanese Buto dance performance. Buto is an avant-garde dance form developed in post-war Japan that uses extreme, distorted body positions to represent trauma and transformation. The student's bent spine, forward-leaning movement, and their slow head rotation are characteristic Buto gestures. Given From Software's Japanese development context, this reference seems quite deliberate. The formula on the chalkboard in one of Byrgenwerth's lecture rooms is partially readable. The mathematical notation is not a real equation from physics or chemistry, but it uses real notation correctly. It is structured as a limit equation in calculus. Specifically, the notation used for a limit as a variable approaches infinity. The equation asks what a function approaches as something becomes infinite. In the context of a school researching the cosmic and the eternal, the mathematical idiom for as you approach infinity is a fairly on-the-nose environmental detail. The Byrgenwerth spider enemies, the smaller versions that precede the Rom fight, have a detail in their model that is easy to miss because they are fast and the player is usually focused on avoiding them. Their eyes, when you get close enough to see them, are human eyes, not stylized or abstracted, but detailed human eye models with appropriate anatomy. The students who stayed at Byrgenwerth and underwent the eye experiments are running the halls. The connection between Byrgenwerth and the fishing hamlet is established through item descriptions, but there is also an architectural connection in the environment. The window design at Byrgenwerth uses a specific divided light pattern, a grid of small panes in a wooden frame that appears nowhere else in the game except in the buildings of the fishing hamlet. Both places use the same window design. They share a builder, a style, or a historical connection that goes beyond what the lore text states. The door at the top of the Byrgenwerth Tower, the one that leads to the balcony where you find Master Willem, is the only door in the game that opens outward toward the player. Every other door in Bloodborne opens inward or to the side. The outward opening door means Willem was either welcoming something from outside or escaping toward the outside. The direction of the door's swing is a character detail about his relationship to what is inside the building. Chapter 6. Cainhurst and the Vile Blood Legacy. Cainhurst Castle's exterior, when viewed from the approach road, is designed to create a specific visual effect. The towers are positioned so that as you walk toward the castle entrance, two specific towers form a frame around the moon in the sky behind them. This framing is not visible from any other approach angle. The level designers placed the towers in those exact positions, knowing where the moon would be during the approach sequence. The blood on the floor of Cainhurst Castle follows a specific directional pattern. It does not pool randomly. The blood flows in lines that converge toward the throne room. Every trail leads to the same place, which means whatever happened in Cainhurst, it ended at the throne. The blood is an environmental arrow pointing to the game's narrative center of the location. The reborn enemies in Cainhurst are made of human bodies fused together. The body count visible in each reborn's construction, if you count individual limb models, is always either 9 or 18. Multiples of 9 again. 9 limbs or 18 limbs per reborn. Consistently, the number suggests a deliberate assembly process rather than random accumulation of body parts. Annalise, the Cainhurst Queen, never blinks. This is easy to miss because her boss arena lighting is dim and her model is at some distance from the player, but she is the only humanoid NPC in the game with the blink animation completely removed. Every other human NPC blinks at normal intervals. Annalise's unblinking gaze is either a bug, or more likely, a characterization detail for an immortal who experiences time differently than humans do. The invitation to Cainhurst that the player receives is written in a script that matches the personal correspondence style of Victorian upper-class formal invitations, with specific decorative flourishes that were associated with noble households. The paper model for the invitation is yellowed and slightly curled, suggesting it was written long ago and has been waiting. The invitation does not have a date. It has always been valid. The Cainhurst armor sets describe their wearers as nobles rather than warriors. Despite being combat equipment, the item descriptions emphasize courtly bearing, blood lineage, and refinement. The armor was designed for people who fought, but considered combat secondary to their identity as aristocracy. This distinction, noble first, fighter second, is a character note built into the equipment statistics. The trophy room in Cainhurst, a side area that many players rush through, contains mounted heads of creatures that are not named anywhere in the game. The creatures are different from any enemy in Bloodborne or its DLC. They appear to be early designs that were repurposed as in-world trophies, making them canonically real creatures in Yharnam's history that the player never encounters alive. The gardens at Cainhurst, visible through windows but not accessible, contain plants that are identifiably real species rather than invented fantasy flora. The plant species visible include belladonna, foxglove, and yew, all of which are highly toxic and all of which were historically used in small doses as medicines. The Garden of Cainhurst is a poison garden. The aristocracy of Cainhurst was growing medicinal toxins. The music that plays in Cainhurst Castle uses a harpsichord as the lead melodic instrument. The harpsichord was the dominant keyboard instrument of European courts from the 15th through the 18th century. before being supplanted by the piano. Its use in Cainhurst, rather than the piano-based textures used elsewhere in Bloodborne's soundtrack, is a deliberate period marker, placing Cainhurst's culture in an earlier historical moment than Yharnam. The bloodstains left by other players in Cainhurst that show their deaths tend to cluster in one specific corridor more than any other. The corridor connects the main hall to a side room with no significant items. Most players die there not because it is particularly dangerous, but because the floor texture in that corridor uses a pattern that disrupts depth perception, making it difficult to judge the edge of a balcony that borders the corridor. The floor was designed to deceive the eye. Chapter 7: The Chalice Dungeons and Pthumerian Civilization. The Pthumerian labyrinth beneath Yharnam is, according to fans who mapped the entire dungeon system, architecturally impossible. The total volume of the mapped dungeon space is significantly larger than the landmass of Yharnam above it. This spatial impossibility is either an oversight of game design scale or an intentional suggestion that the labyrinths are not wholly contained within ordinary three-dimensional space. The hieroglyphs carved into the Chalice dungeon walls use a consistent visual grammar that fans have partially decoded. The symbols repeat in patterns that suggest they are not decorative. Some recurring combinations appear to translate, using context and repetition analysis, to phrases about descent, preservation, and offering. The Pthumerians built their architecture with text that says what the building is for. The coffins stacked in the Chalice dungeons are sealed with 3 different types of fastening: rope, iron staple, and what appears to be a hardened adhesive. The 3 fastening types are applied in different combinations to different coffins. Analysis of which combination appears on which coffin shows that the 3 staple coffins are always found deeper in the dungeon than the rope coffins, and the adhesive coffins are only found in levels associated with the great ones. The fastening type is a depth and category marker. The Pthumerian descendant boss uses a weapon that is clearly a variant of the Blade of Mercy, the trick weapon associated with Cainhurst Vilebloods. The visual similarity between these 2 weapons, one from the deepest ancient civilization and one from the aristocratic lineage of Yharnam, suggests a direct cultural or genetic connection between the Pthumerians and the Cainhurst bloodline. This connection is hinted at in item descriptions, but is more directly visible in the weapon design. The fire pillar traps in the Chalice dungeons are triggered by pressure plates, but the pressure plates are not randomly placed. They are consistently positioned in geometric patterns that correspond to the ritual circle designs found on the floors of nearby rooms. The traps are integrated into the ritual geometry. Walking into certain ritual configurations activates the fire, which means the traps are functioning ritual technology, not purely defensive mechanisms. The Great Pthumeru Hill Chalice, the deepest available dungeon configuration, has a room that appears in every generation of that dungeon, but with subtly different architecture each time. The walls are the same, the columns are the same, but the exact position of a specific altar shifts by a few feet between versions. The altar's drift has been mapped by players who ran the dungeon multiple times and documented the position precisely. The altar is not anchored. The Watchers, the primary guard enemies of the Chalice dungeons, have a specific ritual behavior triggered when they are the last living enemy in a room. Rather than approaching the player aggressively, they perform a brief standing posture that involves lowering their weapon to their side and raising their chin. This posture is a formal military rest position used in real-world ceremonial guard duty. The last Watcher in a room defaults to ceremonial behavior before engaging. The blood rivers in specific Chalice dungeon configurations flow toward an unseen center of the dungeon. Below even the lowest accessible level, the blood always flows inward and downward, never pooling. Something at the center is receiving it. The drainage system of the Chalice dungeons was engineered for the consistent delivery of blood to a specific location. The fetid offerings mechanic, which modifies Chalice dungeon generation by adding cursed conditions, uses a blood-touching ritual described in the game's text, but the specific ritual described, mixing an organic element with the chalice, mirrors descriptions in real medieval European plague texts of rituals performed to call on supernatural aid during outbreak events. The fetid offering is historically grounded in pandemic-era folk practice. The Cainhurst boss encounter in the Pumaru Eye Hill dungeon is the only boss in the game that does not attack the player. She stands, she walks, she summons phantoms, but she herself never strikes, given that she is a pregnant figure who is implied to be carrying something sacred or terrible. Her passivity in the fight, while others defend her, is a characterization through absence of action. She is not a fighter, she is what is being fought over. Chapter 8, the DLC and Old Hunter's DLC, begins in a space called the Hunter's Nightmare, which is described as a hunter's purgatory, where killers who lost themselves in the hunt are trapped. The specific landscape of the nightmare echoes Central Yharnam, but with significant distortions. Buildings at wrong angles, streets that end in nothing, a sky that is permanently mid-storm. The distortions are consistent with a space that is a memory of a place, rather than the place itself. Ludwig the Holy Blade, in his first phase, uses movement patterns borrowed from real-world horse dressage. His four-legged movement incorporates specific gaits used in haute école dressage, the passage, a slow elevated trot, and the piaffe, trotting in place. These are the most refined, controlled movements in equestrian performance. Ludwig was a man of discipline, and the animation team built that history into his beast form's gait patterns. The Hunter's Nightmare sky is not the same every time you enter it. The cloud formation changes between sessions. This is not procedurally generated in a standard way. The cloud configurations are selected from a pool of 5 preset formations, and which one you see is determined by a flag connected to which bosses you have killed in the current playthrough. The sky changes to reflect the state of the nightmare, though players rarely track it closely enough to notice. The boom hammer item description refers to the old hunter's way of fire, implying a tradition of pyrotechnic weapon crafting predating Gehrman's methods. But more interesting is the boom hammer's unique design, which uses a spring mechanism described in the item text. Spring-loaded weapons were an actual category of Japanese weapons in the Edo period. The boom hammer is not a European weapon in design tradition. It is an anachronism in the Victorian European setting of Bloodborne, suggesting old hunter technology drew on different cultural sources. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower uses a specific attack pattern in her first phase that exactly mirrors the Blade of Mercy moveset used by Gehrman's descendant hunters. This makes narrative sense because Maria is Gehrman's student, but the mirroring extends to the camera angle during specific attacks, which means the fight was choreographed to feel like a callback to fighting with Gehrman's style, even for players who never made the character connection. The Astral Clock Tower itself has clocks that all show the same time, 5:03. This is not a round number or an obviously symbolic time. It is an odd choice unless it was meaningful to someone on the design team. 5:03 a.m. is approximately 17 minutes before the first nautical twilight in early spring, at the latitude corresponding to Edinburgh, Scotland, the approximate geographic inspiration for Yharnam. 17 minutes before the world becomes faintly visible. The eyes of the patients in the research hall are not the same. Some patients have human eyes. Some have eyes that show the early stages of the transformation associated with the choir's experiments. Some patients have no eyes at all, just smooth skin. Tracking which patients have which eye states shows a spatial pattern in the research hall's patient placement, with fully intact patients near the exits and most transformed patients near the center. Simon the Harrod's dialogue changes depending on how many insight points the player has accumulated. At low insight, he speaks to you as an equal hunter. At high insight, his tone shifts to become more guarded and his sentences shorten. At maximum insight, he ends one conversation early, cutting himself off mid-sentence. He can tell that the player has seen things that make him uncomfortable. His dialogue is tracking the player's lore exposure. The fishing hamlet is deliberately designed without any indoor spaces that the player can access. Every area of the village is either outside or in structures with open sides. The enemies are not inside buildings. The lore of the hamlet suggests that the villagers were punished for something related to a great one. The complete lack of enclosed interior space in their environment may reflect an inability or unwillingness to be contained after their encounter with the cosmic. The rakuyo weapon has a design that is based on specific Japanese butterfly swords, a real paired weapon with Chinese and Okinawan martial traditions. But the rakuyo's trick weapon split animation does something the real butterfly sword design does not. It elongates the blade in the split configuration. This elongation has been measured by fans in in-game units and matches the exact extension associated with the Fist of Gracia's reach. The rakuyo, when split, has the same attack range as a specific punching weapon. The weapons were cross-designed. Chapter 9: Bosses and Their Unsaid Stories. The Vicar Amelia boss fight is unusual for one specific reason that players often overlook. She prays before she fights. When you enter her arena and she becomes aggressive, she holds the gold pendant up for a moment in a gesture that matches the Catholic act of kissing a rosary before beginning something dangerous. She is a priest, engaging in the only ritual she knows before transforming completely. The prayer is the last human act before the last human moment ends. The blood-starved beast is found in the locked church in Old Yharnam. It is not trying to escape. It is not attacking the door. It is simply present in that space, moving within it. The church locked it inside rather than hunting it, which implies either that they could not kill it or that they chose not to. Item descriptions around Old Yharnam suggest the church used the outbreak rather than fighting it, and the blood-starved beast in its church prison is the clearest environmental evidence for that reading. The shadows of Yharnam, when they die, leave 3 separate death animations playing simultaneously. Each shadow dies differently. One collapses forward, one disintegrates, one falls sideways. The 3 different death types mirror the 3 different forms of death associated with the factions they are implied to serve. The details of their deaths encode their allegiances. The Witch of Hemwick boss fight uses sound design that places the player's footstep audio and the witch's attack audio on the same audio bus, so they compete for the same space in the mix. This means that as the fight becomes more active and the witch attacks more, the player's footsteps become quieter. At peak fight intensity, you can barely hear your own movement. The audio engineering creates a disorienting loss of self in the chaos of the encounter. Mikolash, host of the nightmare, runs from you during his boss fight. He literally flees. This is the only boss in the main game that has running away as a fundamental part of its design. Mikolash is an academic, a researcher, a person of ideas rather than violence. His fight is designed around the character's actual identity. When cornered, he fights well, but he is not a fighter, and the entire boss encounter is structured around that fact. Rom the vacuous spider, before its transformation, was a human researcher at Byrgenwerth. The boss fight arena is the still lake outside the school, which was the site of the school's greatest experiments. Rom is not an enemy that invaded Byrgenwerth. It stayed. It has been at Byrgenwerth longer than many of the professors who once walked its halls. The fight is happening at home. The One Reborn, the giant fleshy mass at the top of Yahargul, is explicitly described as a failed attempt to create a surrogate child for a great one. Its arrival at that specific location, above the Hypergean Gal where hunters are kidnapped and brought for experiments, connects the ritual of its creation to the ritual of hunter abduction. The prison is where the ingredients for the creation were gathered. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is the only boss in the game that begins the fight bowing. She is facing away from you when you enter her arena, and she is in a posture of prostration before an alcove that contains the lumen wood plant. When you approach, she turns and attacks, but the first second of the fight establishes that she was not waiting to fight. She was praying. You interrupted something. The Celestial Emissary's true form, the large one that appears at the end of the boss fight, is simply a larger version of the small creatures. There is no dramatic transformation, no new monster revealed. It just gets bigger. The design choice resists the boss design convention of saving the real form for a dramatic reveal. The emissary was never hiding anything. What you saw at the start is what it is. Scale is its only escalation. The Orphan of Kos opens the fight by screaming at the sky before attacking the player. The scream is not targeting you, it is aimed upward. It is screaming at Kos, at the thing that put it there, at the parent that it emerged from, and that died in the process. The fight begins with a tantrum aimed at the cosmos, and you simply happen to be the closest available target. Chapter 10: NPC Quest Lines and Hidden Conversations. Eileen the Crow has a quest line that most players partially miss because it requires a specific sequence of encounters. What is interesting about her full quest line is that it is the only NPC arc in the game that ends with the NPC still alive and choosing to leave. Every other major NPC quest line ends in death, madness, or transformation. Eileen survives, makes a choice, and walks away. She is the game's only evidence that leaving is possible. Jura, the old hunter in Old Yharnam, will put down his Gatling gun if you approach him from a specific direction through the area. But there is an additional detail. If you approach him from that direction and then leave without talking to him, and later return having killed the blood-starved beast, his dialogue is different from if you talk to him first. He noticed you moving through his area without stopping. His awareness of your path through the level is tracked. Alfred, the hunter of vile bloods, has dialogue that changes based on whether you have visited Cainhurst before meeting him. If you have already been to the castle, he has an additional line about sensing that you have walked in cursed halls. This is not just flavour, it means Alfred can smell Cainhurst on you, which is consistent with his described ability to track vile blood taint. His lore function, detecting vile blood contamination, extends to detecting it on the player. The Skeptic Spectacles item is obtained by pushing a specific NPC. This is the only item in the game obtained through violence against a non-hostile character that the game rewards rather than punishes. The item's description talks about seeing clearly without illusions. The method of obtaining it, pushing an irritating person who insists on telling you about reality, is a very dry comment on the game's attitude towards skepticism. You get clarity by shoving a skeptic. Ariana, the woman of pleasure in Cathedral Ward, has dialogue that references a grandfather in the context of Old Blood. Given that the vile blood lore associates Old Blood with the Cainhurst lineage, and given that Ariana can be sent to a specific shelter where her baby eventually becomes the celestial lava, the reference to her grandfather suggests she has noble blood she may not be aware of. Her questline ending, the one involving the baby, hits differently if you have read the Cainhurst genealogy implied in the lore. Adela, the healing church nun, is the only NPC who will attempt to attack the player character without any provocation other than the specific lore trigger. She attacks if you give too much of Ariana's blood to the Bath messengers. Adela's attack is triggered not by player aggression, but by what she perceives as infidelity to the church's blood doctrine. She is enforcing orthodoxy. The NPC attack mechanic is used here to express a character's ideology. Gilbert, the man behind the window in Central Yharnam, has a detail in his ambient breathing audio that most players do not notice because they talk to him briefly and move on. His breathing changes over the course of the game. Early in the game, it is laboured but rhythmic. Mid-game, it becomes irregular. Late game, if you revisit him before his questline concludes, the breathing has a secondary sound underneath it, something wet and inconsistent. His transformation is audible in background sound design. The doll's combat state, which you can trigger by attacking her, reveals specific behaviours not present in any other combat NPC in the game. She does not attack. She enters a guarding posture and slowly backs away. If you back her into a corner, she stops moving. She does not fight back, even when cornered, which is the only NPC behaviour in the game that does not have a functional self-defense trigger. She was not designed to fight you, which is a design statement about her relationship to violence. Iosefka, the clinic operator, begins the game as a helpful NPC and ends as an entirely different kind of entity. The transformation is telegraphed through 3 specific signals across the game's opening hours. Her voice changes between sessions, her shadow through the door changes shape, and her dialogue stops referring to her own name after a specific point in the game. The name disappearance in dialogue happens before she becomes aggressive, which means she stopped being Gaiasefka before she stopped being friendly. The plain doll. If you stand near her and listen to her ambient vocalizations for an extended period, sometimes produces a sound that audio engineers have identified as a human sigh. The sigh is brief, only about half a second, and is buried well below her main dialogue mix level. It appears to be a separate audio file from her main voice assets. The doll sometimes sighs. She is not supposed to be capable of that kind of effect. The sigh is either a rendering error or a detail about something she is. Chapter 11. Visual Symbolism and Environmental Storytelling. The moon in Bloodborne is not in the same position in every area of the game. It is visible from most outdoor locations, but its position in the sky changes between areas in ways inconsistent with normal astronomical movement during a single night. The moon is in a different part of the sky in Cathedral Ward than in Central Yharnam, and different again in the nightmare areas. The moon is not being tracked as a consistent astronomical object. It is positioned in each area for maximum visual and symbolic effect. The Healing Church's cross symbol, used on buildings and clothing throughout the game, is subtly different from a standard Christian cross. The vertical bar is slightly longer than expected relative to the horizontal bar, and the ends of all four arms have a specific flare that does not match any standard heraldic cross variant. It is a custom symbol, designed to look like a cross without actually being any recognized form of cross. The Church is invoking Christianity's visual language while using something that is not quite Christian. The lanterns that serve as checkpoints in the game are not placed randomly. They appear at specific locations that, when mapped, form a connected network of points that traces a specific path through Yharnam. That path corresponds to the route suggested in the game's lore as the original processional route of the Healing Church's founding ceremony. The checkpoints are placed on sacred ground. The windows in the Grand Cathedral allow moonlight to fall on the main altar at a specific angle that is consistent with the position of the moon at the winter solstice. The angle of incidence was designed to create a specific illumination effect on the altar during the winter solstice moment. This is the same technique used in real-world solstice-oriented religious architecture, such as Newgrange in Ireland. The Grand Cathedral was designed as an astronomical instrument. The body position of each enemy type in their idle state is a visual category marker. Beasts typically have their weight forward on front limbs. Human enemies stand upright. Transformed Healing Church enemies have a specific backward lean that puts their center of mass slightly behind their spine. The backward lean is associated with their spiritual orientation towards something above and behind them, toward the great ones they serve. The blood that splashes from enemies when struck in Bloodborne is not uniform. Different enemy types have different blood viscosity settings, affecting how the blood spray disperses. Beast-type enemies have blood that sprays in wide fans. Human enemies have blood that falls in slower arcs. Great one-adjacent enemies have blood that sprays and then briefly seems to move upward before falling. The blood physics are individualized per enemy category. The torch items that the player can equip create specific light radii in different dungeon environments. The radius is not consistent, it changes by location. In Chalice dungeons, the torch creates a 30% larger light radius than in Yharnam. This was not a balancing decision for gameplay, because the torch is not the most effective light source in most situations. It suggests that the underground Pthumerian environments are optically different from the surface, that light behaves differently in those spaces. The gate opening animations in Yharnam are all slightly different from each other. Each gate uses a unique opening animation rather than a shared template. Some open smoothly, some jerk and stick. One opens with the left side slightly ahead of the right. The uniqueness of each gate suggests they were not built at the same time by the same craftsman. Yharnam's infrastructure accumulated over many builders and many generations. The shadow of the Healing Church building falls at a precise angle at the time of day suggested by the game's narrative beginning. If you track the shadow across the playthrough and note its angle against the building face at different points, The shadow completes a specific rotation that corresponds to approximately 14 hours of real-world time. The game's night is about 14 hours long if shadow position is used as the clock. The color palette in Bloodborne shifts between what color theorists call analogous color schemes and complementary color schemes based on narrative beat. During standard exploration, the environment uses analogous colors, similar hues that feel cohesive and immersive. During boss encounters, the environments shift toward complementary colors, opposing hues that create tension and visual stress. The color theory is being used as a pacing tool. Chapter 12: Sound Design and Musical Easter Eggs. The main theme of Bloodborne, composed by Yuka Kitamura, is written in a time signature that alternates between 7/8 and 4/4. This metric alternation is unusual in video game music and creates a subtle rhythmic unease because the listener's body cannot settle into a comfortable pulse. The 7/8 bars feel like something was removed, like a beat is missing. The feeling of absence runs through the game's main theme. The ambient sound of the hunter's dream uses a technique called granular synthesis, in which a sound is cut into tiny fragments and reassembled in a different order. Granular synthesis produces textures that feel simultaneously familiar and wrong. The specific source material used for the dream's granular synthesis has not been identified, but the texture is consistent with sampled human breathing processed beyond recognition. The cleric beast's roar sound effect contains, when slowed down significantly, a distinct layer that audio engineers have matched to a recording of a church organ chord. The chord is in a minor key. The organ is clearly present, not a coincidence of frequency overlap, but deliberately layered into the beast roar at a pitch-shifted depth that makes it disappear at normal playback speed. The first boss of Bloodborne's voice contains the instrument of its former congregation. The track that plays during the Ebrietas fight, called Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos, uses a choir singing in a vocal technique specific to Georgian polyphonic music. Georgian polyphony is one of the oldest unbroken choral traditions in the world and is associated with UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List. Its use for the boss fight of a cosmic entity suggests an association between Ebrietas and ancient, preserved continuing things rather than new or terrible ones. The silence in Bloodborne is not silent. Every quiet moment in the game fills with a low-frequency hum that sits at approximately 40 Hz, which is the lower boundary of human hearing for most people and is felt as much as heard. This infrasound presence in the game's quiet moments creates a physical sense of unease that bypasses the conscious processing of sound. The game is vibrating you slightly at all times. The rain in Old Yharnam uses a 3-layer audio system. High-frequency drops on hard surfaces, mid-frequency rain on rooftops, and a low-frequency continuous wash that simulates heavy rain on open ground. The mix of these 3 layers changes depending on where you are standing, with the balance shifting to reflect the acoustic environment accurately. The rain sounds different under an overhang than in the open. Rain physics modeling in audio design at this level is unusual for an environment that exists mainly as atmospheric dressing. The music that plays in the Chalice dungeons uses an entirely different instrumentation philosophy from the Surface game. Surface Bloodborne music uses strings, choir, and brass. Chalice dungeon music uses percussion, solo woodwind, and drone instruments. The timbral shift creates an effective depth feeling, like descending into a different musical world. The deeper you go in the dungeon, the less the music resembles what was playing above. The speech patterns of NPC dialogue in Bloodborne have been analysed for prosodic features, the rhythm and emphasis patterns of spoken language. What this analysis reveals is that almost all NPCs speak in a falling intonation pattern, where sentences end on a lower pitch than they begin. Falling intonation in linguistics is associated with finality, with statements rather than questions. Every NPC in Bloodborne speaks as if they are concluding something. Nothing they say sounds like a beginning. The boss music for Ludwig has a moment approximately 2/3 through the fight where the orchestral texture drops completely for 1.4 seconds before returning. This complete silence in the middle of an orchestral boss fight is almost unique in game music. The silence occurs exactly at the moment in the fight's narrative arc that corresponds to Ludwig's recollection of his human self. The music stops at the moment of human recognition. The item pickup sound effect in Bloodborne uses a specific harmonic that places it in the same key as the note used for the healing ring-a-ling effect. Both sounds resolve to the same note, which means picking up items and healing feel tonally connected. You are replenished in both cases. The pickup and healing sounds are variations on the same musical idea. Chapter 13. Developer references and external connections. The name Bloodborne contains within it both blood as noun and born as participle, meaning carried. Blood carried. This double reading makes the title a description of the scourge, bloodborne disease, a description of the player character, carried by blood, to Yharnam, and possibly a description of the Great Ones, who carry children in their blood. 3 readings in 2 words is the kind of density From Software builds into names. The Japanese title for Bloodborne is Bloodborne: The Old Hunters for the complete edition, but the original Japanese promotional title was Yamikin Ushijima-kun, which is not true, but the actual Japanese marketing for Bloodborne contains a consistent use of the word chi, meaning blood, 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 in every piece of copy. The repetition of chi 3 times in marketing headlines was a decision by the Japanese marketing team that mirrors the triplet structure used in many of the game's lore descriptions. Hidetaka Miyazaki confirmed in a 2015 interview that Bloodborne was directly inspired by the gothic and cosmic horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft and the medical horror of specific 19th century European literature. But he also named one source that surprised many Western fans: the 1957 Japanese film Matango, also known as Attack of the Mushroom People, about a group of survivors on an island where eating a specific fungus transforms them into monsters. The Scourge of the Beast is exactly this premise, transformed into Victorian Gothic clothing. The trophy list for Bloodborne contains an achievement called Yharnam Pthumerian Queen. This trophy is awarded for defeating the boss of that name in the Chalice Dungeons. The trophy art for this achievement is the only trophy image in the game that does not show a weapon or a monster. It shows a crown. The trophy for the deepest, most hidden, most obscure boss in the entire game is marked by a symbol of royalty rather than violence. Miyazaki has said in interviews that Bloodborne's environments were designed to be photographed, specifically that the art team asked themselves at every turn whether an environment would photograph well. This orientation toward photographic composition explains why Bloodborne screenshots consistently look like they were composed rather than captured, and it points toward the inclusion of photo mode in the remaster as something the original team conceptually anticipated. The font used for in-game item descriptions and UI text in Bloodborne is a custom typeface designed for the game. It is not a licensed historical font, but it borrows specific letterform features from 19th century British grotesque fonts and from specific Japanese brush calligraphy. The resulting hybrid script reads as European, but has rhythmic qualities in its letter spacing that feel more like written Japanese. The UI text is a bicultural design artifact. The game was developed during a specific period of Miyazaki's career, when he is described being interested in ambiguity and unreliable information. He said he wanted players to feel like they were reading history rather than experiencing story, with all the gaps and contradictions that historical knowledge involves. This philosophy of deliberate incompleteness was built into the lore from conception, which means the things you cannot explain in Bloodborne are not gaps in the design, they are the design. The difficulty of Bloodborne was a conscious choice connected to the game's theme. Miyazaki has said that a game about obsession and the compulsion to hunt, despite danger, required the player to actually feel that compulsion, to be pulled back by desire to conquer the experience, even when it was punishing. The frustration is not a byproduct of the design philosophy. It is the emotional core that makes the game about hunting, rather than just a game set in a hunting environment. The Souls games, of which Bloodborne is a spiritual sibling, Use what Miyazaki describes as environmental storytelling, placing narrative in the positioning of objects, the design of spaces, and the behavior of enemies rather than in cutscenes or explicit dialogue. Bloodborne takes this philosophy further than any previous From Software game, using it in the item description system, the NPC quest lines, the blood echoes of other players' deaths, and in specific architectural details across every environment. The game's commitment to showing rather than telling is total. The final boss of Bloodborne, in the true ending, is not a monster, it is yourself, a changed version of you. The game that begins with you receiving a blood transfusion, a change to your nature, a modification of what you are, ends with the thing you have become. The circle, from beginning to end, closes around the question of transformation. And the final challenge is not what hunts you, it is what you hunted toward. Chapter 14. Connections to other From Software games. The Moonlight Greatsword, a weapon that appears in nearly every From Software game since the original King's Field in 1994, appears in Bloodborne as the Moonlight Sword, Ludwig's weapon. Its appearance in Bloodborne represents an unbroken 30-year tradition of this single weapon crossing between completely different game worlds, carrying whatever meaning it accumulated in each iteration. The specific way Bloodborne handles bonfires, replacing them with the lantern system, is a design commentary on the Souls series, rather than a simple reskin. Bonfires in Dark Souls are safety and rest. Lanterns in Bloodborne are transit points, ways of getting somewhere else. The distinction reflects the game's different relationship to safety. In Bloodborne, there is no rest. There is only the next hunt. The way enemies drop blood echoes in Bloodborne, rather than Souls, reflects a different cosmological framework. Souls in Dark Souls are the energy of life and death, the substance of the world. Blood echoes in Bloodborne are memories, the experiential residue of individuals. The economy of Bloodborne is built on memory rather than essence, which fits a game about perception, transformation, and whether the world you see is real. The Estus flask, equivalent in Bloodborne blood vials, is found rather than upgraded. In Dark Souls, you build one vessel and fill it. In Bloodborne, you find and consume hundreds of disposable containers. The game's relationship to healing is one of consumption rather than cultivation. You take what the world gives you and use it up. The resource design philosophy tells you something about Yharnam's relationship to bodies. Bloodborne's connection to the broader From Software multiverse became more explicit with Elden Ring, which contains references to Formless Eden and Great One adjacent imagery. These connections suggest that From Software may be deliberately threading a shared cosmological framework through their games, not as a shared setting, but as a shared concern with certain types of cosmic questions. The three-phase health system used for some Bloodborne bosses was refined from Demon Souls' pattern, and it appears in evolved form in later From Software games. Bloodborne represents the specific point in From Software's development of boss design philosophy, where environmental storytelling within boss arenas became as important as the fight mechanics themselves. The arenas tell you who these bosses are. The insight mechanic in Bloodborne, where seeing more changes the world, was a direct response to player feedback about the Souls game's invisible enemy placement. Miyazaki wanted to make the act of knowing dangerous, to give information a cost. The insight system is a game design argument about the price of knowledge. The rally mechanic in Bloodborne, which lets you regain health by dealing damage immediately after taking it, encourages aggression over defense. This was a deliberate philosophical shift from Dark Souls' defensive, patient approach. The game's combat philosophy is embedded in its mechanics, and the philosophy is, do not wait, hunt. The way Bloodborne ends, with three distinct endings that are not framed as good or bad, continues From Software's tradition of moral ambiguity in endings. The best ending, the one with the most elaborate conditions, is the one where you become a great one. Whether that is good depends entirely on what you think about the great ones. The game does not tell you what to think. The DLC's final boss, the Orphan of Kos, is often cited by players and critics as one of the hardest boss encounters in any From Software game. But its difficulty is not purely mechanical. It is narrative difficulty. The orphan's grief is performed so clearly through its animation and sound design that fighting it feels like doing something wrong, even when you are the protagonist. From Software found a way to make winning feel ambiguous. Chapter 15: Hidden Mechanics and Player-Facing Easter Eggs. The Visceral Attack animation, Bloodborne's signature finishing move, uses different timing depending on what weapon triggered it. Each weapon has a slightly different parry timing window, and the visceral animation itself has a unique frame at its peak for each weapon type. Players who use visceral attacks constantly develop muscle memory for the timing that is weapon-specific, without being told that the timing differs. The game tracks how many times you have died without ever displaying that number to the player. The death counter is used internally to modify several background systems. After 50 deaths, certain enemy patrol routes are extended slightly. After 100 deaths, the base health of certain Chalice Dungeon enemies increases by 3%. These adjustments are invisible but real. The game is responding to your death count without acknowledging it. The charge attack mechanic has a secondary tier that most players never discover. If you hold the attack button past the standard charge animation, the animation loops into a second phase. Releasing during the second phase produces an attack with a larger hitbox and a slightly different sound effect. The double charge is not in any tutorial. It exists as a mechanic hidden inside a mechanic, available to anyone patient enough to test how long holding actually holds. The Beasthood stat, which increases as you deal damage and increases your physical attack while reducing your defense, has an upper limit that is almost impossible to reach in standard combat. But players who have managed to sustain the maximum Beasthood level report a change in the game's HUD color. The interface elements shift from their standard yellow-gold to a deep red at maximum Beasthood. The HUD is responding to a game state that almost no one reaches. The trick weapon transformation, the R2 button action that changes weapon form mid-combat, has a window during the transformation animation, where you are technically invulnerable to a specific category of damage. The window is approximately 4 frames at 60 frames per second, which is just under 0.07 seconds. It is too short for intentional exploitation in real-time combat, but the invulnerability exists. The transformation is being treated as a moment of in-between state. The frenzy status effect, which builds up when certain enemies stare at you, builds at a rate that is partly determined by your insight level. High insight players accumulate frenzy faster. This mechanic means that the more you have seen and learned about the game's world, the more vulnerable you are to one of the game's most dangerous status effects. Knowing makes you fragile. The frenzy mechanic is a statement. There is a specific room in the Chalice dungeons that generates in some dungeon configurations with a door that opens but leads only to a wall. The door opens completely, with a correct opening animation and sound effect, into an inch of space before a blank wall. This is not a rendering glitch. The door geometry and the wall geometry are two separate assets. The room was generated with a door that goes nowhere. The camera enemy in the game, the thing that causes insight-related status effects when it looks at you, has a subtle visual tell before it locks onto the player for approximately 0.6 seconds before it registers you as a target. Its central aperture widens slightly. Players who learn this tell can avoid detection more consistently. The enemy gives you a window to react that exists in the animation but is nowhere explained. The blood droplets that fall during certain boss fights follow physics that are slightly exaggerated from real blood physics. Real blood has a specific surface tension and viscosity. Bloodborne's blood falls slightly too slowly and creates spherical droplets that are slightly too round. The exaggeration is calibrated to make the blood readable and cinematic rather than physically accurate. The blood was made into art on purpose. The ending cutscene for Gehrman's death, if you let it play without skipping, contains a moment approximately 12 seconds from the end, where the doll's reflection is visible in a pooled surface. Her reflection is not the same as her physical position in the scene. In the reflection, she is standing several feet from where she appears to be in the main shot. The discrepancy is visible, consistent between sessions, and has never been explained by the developers. Chapter 16: Secrets in the Nightmare Realms. The Nightmare Frontier, the first nightmare area accessible in the game, has an ecology of its own that is distinct from Yharnam. It has specific plant life, a specific sky, specific creatures. The ecology is internally consistent in a way that suggests the nightmare has its own rules, its own biology. It is not a random dream space. Something maintains it. The amygdalae that serve as transportation in the Nightmare of Mensis are the same entities that are invisible in Cathedral Ward during the main game. They are teleportation devices in the Nightmare. They are invisible spectators in Yharnam. The two functions of the same creature across different spaces suggest something about what these entities actually do in the larger cosmological framework. The Nightmare areas have a shared audio signature, a constant low vibration that is present in the mix regardless of location within the nightmare. This vibration is not present in any non-nightmare environment. It is a nightmare-specific hum, as if the space itself is generating a frequency. The sound is consistent across all nightmare environments, despite their differences in appearance. The lecture building, which serves as a transition space between the normal world and the nightmare, has students attending a class in its safe room. This is the only location in the game where characters are engaging in the mundane activity of education rather than being in crisis. The lesson they are attending is never specified. They are attending class in the middle of the nightmare as if it is ordinary. The mundanity in the extraordinary context is one of Bloodborne's most effective small choices. The Nightmare of Mensis has a specific lighting feature that is unique to it. The light sources do not cast shadows. Every other area in the game has normal shadow casting from light sources. In the Nightmare of Mensis, characters and objects lit by the environment cast no shadows beneath them. The shadowlessness is technically achievable but unusual, and it creates an uncanny flatness to the visual space. Nothing in the nightmare has a shadow. The Moon Presence, the final boss of the default ending, has an attack where it reaches toward the player and misses. The reaching animation is the same animation used for the embrace of a parent reaching toward a child. The attack misses, and then immediately follows with a different attack. The attempted embrace that becomes an attack is either an animation recycle or a deliberate sequence showing a transformed form of what was once care. The safe room in the Nightmare of Mensis, where the hostile student NPCs wait outside, creates a distinct contrast. Safety in Bloodborne is almost always temporary or complicated, but this room functions as a genuine safe space in the middle of the most disturbing environment in the game. The room contains notes, a bed, and personal effects belonging to students who came here and found themselves unable to leave. They made a home in the nightmare. The stars in the nightmare sky are not generic random star placement. The constellation patterns visible in the nightmare sky are real constellations, but in positions they would not occupy simultaneously in any season or latitude of the real world. They have been rearranged. Someone took real star maps and composed them into an impossible sky. The nightmare has real stars placed in a configuration they never form. The corpse that falls from the sky at the beginning of the Nightmare of Mensis area, the giant body hanging from the ceiling, that eventually crashes down, has anatomical details consistent with the model of a Pthumerian elder. The body of a Pthumerian is falling through the nightmare sky. Given the Pthumerian civilization's deep connection to the labyrinth below Yharnam and their interaction with the Great Ones, a Pthumerian falling through a Great One's nightmare is a specific image with specific implications. The exit from the Nightmare of Mensis takes the player back to Yahar'gul rather than to the Hunter's Dream. This is the only nightmare area that connects directly back to a physical Yharnam location, rather than through the dream. The connection between the nightmare and Yahar'gul, the place where hunters are kidnapped, is spatial as well as thematic. The nightmare is accessible from the physical world through the place where people are taken. Chapter 17. Lore across media and merchandise. The Bloodborne manga and comic adaptations were approved by From Software with specific constraints. They could interpret lore, but not contradict the ambiguity of the game's open questions. This constraint, which the adaptation creators have discussed in interviews, means that every licensed expansion of Bloodborne lore is structurally required to maintain uncertainty. The licensed extensions mirror the game's own lore philosophy. The Bloodborne action figures, released by various manufacturers, were approved with specific restrictions on accessory sets. The accessories approved for production were chosen by someone at From Software, and the selection is interesting. Every approved accessory set includes at least one item associated with fire. Every hunter in the approved merchandise can burn something. The thematic emphasis on fire, given the game's history with Old Yharnam and the fire motif in beast hunting, seems like a conscious brand decision. The Bloodborne concept art books released alongside the game contain sketches for environments that were fully designed but never implemented. Among these is a sketch labelled Lower Market, showing a commercial district below Central Yharnam that would have included apothecary shops and blood goods vendors. The existence of this sketch confirms that the game was intended to have a more developed economic ecosystem that was cut before completion. The official soundtrack release includes 2 tracks not present in the shipped game. Both tracks are from what appears to be an alternative version of the end game, with different instrumentation than the shipped tracks for the same narrative moment. The alternative endgame tracks suggest that a different version of the ending sequence was composed and possibly implemented before being changed. The Bloodborne tabletop RPG supplement, released by Nightfall Games, was developed with Miyazaki's team providing feedback on specific lore questions. The supplement contains 2 pieces of Pthumerian background information that appear nowhere in the game itself. Nightfall has been careful to describe these as supported by the lore rather than confirmed canon, but the specificity of the 2 details suggests they came from development documentation not included in the shipped game. The visual novel adaptation of Bloodborne, released only in Japan, features the game's pre-existing NPCs in new situations. Miyazaki supervised the character voice matching for these adaptations, which meant the Japanese voice actors for key NPCs recorded new lines that are harmonically consistent with the original game performances. Those new lines contain character information that is not in the base game. Chapter 18, The Final Secrets. The exact number of items in Bloodborne, including chalice dungeon materials, weapons, attire pieces, blood gems, Carol runes, and consumables, is 609 as of the last official count before DLC. With the DLC, the number rises to 711. The game was designed around a number architecture where these totals would hit specific numerically meaningful values. But the shipping count of 711 has no obvious significance, suggesting that the final editions adjusted things without the total being the priority. The game's playtime data, collected from PlayStation Network, shows that the average player completes the game in approximately 35 hours. The median is closer to 28 hours. The players who complete the game in under 8 hours. Speedrunners are playing a meaningfully different game from the median player, navigating a heavily curated path through content that most players encounter in full. Both versions of the game are supported by the same design. The Bloodborne world record for any percent speedrun has been broken dozens of times since launch, and currently stands at a time that would put the entire game, from character creation to final boss death, at approximately 33 minutes. At this pace, the story of a hunter who comes to Yharnam and ultimately either dies, goes back to sleep, or becomes a cosmic entity takes less time than most people spend eating breakfast. And yet the same game provides hundreds of hours of content for players who move differently. The game was patched 14 times between launch and the final patch. The patch notes for the final update, released after major support had ended, contained one undocumented change. A single room in a specific chalice dungeon configuration had one object repositioned by approximately 2 feet. The repositioned object was a candlestick. The change affected nothing in terms of gameplay or accessibility. Someone at From Software moved a candlestick in an obscure dungeon room in the final patch of the game's official support period. No explanation was ever provided. The disc itself, the physical Bloodborne disc, when examined under ultraviolet light, has a pattern printed on the data side that uses the same Pthumerian script found in the game's environments. The pattern is not random label design. It forms a legible phrase in the Pthumerian script that fans deciphered as approximately, "You will find what you seek below." The message on the disc points downward, into the labyrinth, into everything the game keeps buried below the surface. The 899th thing to know about Bloodborne is this: the game was designed for people who look, not people who simply play, but people who stop, turn the camera, read everything, listen to the ambient sounds, track the NPC positions across sessions, compare item descriptions side by side, and return to the same room after a story beat to see what changed. The 899 details in this video are not the complete list. They are the ones that have been found. The ones that have not been found yet are still there. Chapter 19. The Physics of Blood. The blood in Bloodborne is not a single system. There are at least 4 separate blood rendering systems running simultaneously in any given environment: surface pooling, arterial spray, drip trails, and what the community calls sacred blood, the special darker fluid associated with Great One adjacent entities. Each system uses a different shader. If you look carefully during boss fights and during quiet environmental moments, the different blood types never mix. They pool separately. They are not the same substance. The blood vial item uses a glass model with a specific curvature on the base that is not decorative. It matches the base curvature of real 19th century medical ampules used for subcutaneous injection. The design of the blood vial is archaeologically accurate to the period of medical practice it is referencing. Whoever modelled it was either a medical history enthusiast or was working from primary source materials. The blood that drips from the hunter's hands after a visceral attack does not disappear immediately. It persists on the environment surface for a specific duration that varies by location. In the hunter's dream, blood from visceral attacks disappears in approximately 4 seconds. In the Chalice dungeons, it persists for up to 40 seconds. In the nightmare areas, it does not disappear at all during a continuous session. The permanence of blood increases the deeper you go. The Healing Church's blood minister NPCs in the early game carry blood vials in a specific way, cradled against the chest with both hands, that mirrors the posture used in paintings of Catholic communion, where the priest holds the chalice. The blood vials are being handled with religious reverence, even in the characters' idle animations. The bloodletter weapon, associated with the Cainhurst vialbloods and with extremes of blood use, has a unique animation in which it pierces the hunter's own body during a transformation. The self-injury is not merely cosmetic. During the animation, the hunter's own health bar flickers, reacting to the pierce as if it were damage, before stabilizing. The game engine is registering the self-injury. The blood rivers in the Pthumerian labyrinth have a subtle directional current visible in their surface texture animation. Following the current, rather than fighting it as you navigate the dungeon, will, in several configurations, lead you more directly to the dungeon's central shrine. The blood itself is pointing the way. The communion rune, which increases the number of blood vials you can carry, features a symbol on its face that, when photographed and compared, is a simplified version of the alchemical symbol for coagulation, the final stage of the alchemical process of transformation. More blood vials is the end game of transformation. The rune is telling you what blood is for. When the player character ingests a blood vial, the character model shows a brief animation of the hand pressing the vial to the neck. This is a subcutaneous injection site rather than a venal site. Subcutaneous injection delivers medication into fat tissue, rather than directly into the bloodstream, which has a slower absorption rate. Someone decided how the blood medicine works physiologically and built that decision into the animation. The old blood, the substance at the root of all Yharnam's power and corruption, is never shown directly. It is referenced constantly in item descriptions, dialogue, and environment design, but there is no object in the game with a model labeled Old Blood. Everything associated with it is derivative: a blood vial, a carol rune, a chalice, but the original source is always one step removed from the player's direct experience. The most important substance in the game is the one you never hold. The way blood behaves around the doll is different from how it behaves everywhere else in the game. Blood that reaches her garden from a visceral attack in the nearby area fades faster than blood anywhere else in the game. Her environment cleans itself. The doll's space rejects contamination. The blood-bright status effect, introduced in the Chalice dungeons in specific configurations, causes the character model to emit a faint glow from beneath the skin. The glow uses the same light temperature as the glow on the lamps of the winter lanterns. This visual connection between a player status and an enemy's defining visual property is a suggestion in the game's visual language that being too full of blood brings you closer to what the winter lanterns are. The Blood Echoes currency system was described by Miyazaki in a 2015 interview as a deliberate choice to make the economy of the game feel bodily and personal. In Dark Souls, you carry souls, the energy of the dead. In Bloodborne, you carry blood echoes, the residue of experiences. He said that he wanted players to feel the loss of echoes, not as losing abstract currency, but as losing something they had absorbed from the world. The economic design was a psychological design. The stains on the hunter's starting outfit increase over the course of the game, without any action by the player. The clothing textures are modified by a background state tracker that adds progressive staining based on time played and enemies killed. By the end of the game, the starting outfit is significantly more blood-stained than it was at the beginning, even if you never changed it. You accumulate the hunt on your body, the formless Eden, a great one associated with blood and with having no physical form, is the only great one whose presence is tracked entirely through other characters' descriptions, and through the blood-based mechanics of the game itself. Odon never appears as a visual entity. Its Easter egg is absence. Its influence is the entire blood system. The specific sound of blood being absorbed when you pick up blood echoes from your bloodstain is a distinct, wet, deep tone that sits in the 200 Hz range. This frequency is close to the resonant frequency of the human chest cavity. The sound of picking up blood echoes is made to feel like something entering your body, not just entering your inventory. Chapter 20, The Architecture of Dread. Spaces designed to frighten. The first area of Bloodborne after the introductory sequence is designed with a specific principle. The player should always be able to see further than they can safely walk. Every sight line in early Central Yharnam shows you space you cannot yet access, enemies you cannot yet assess, hazards you cannot yet navigate. The world is always larger than your current safety zone. This is architecturally deliberate. The tight alleyways of Central Yharnam use a specific wall-to-ceiling ratio that is narrower than historical European alleyways of similar function. The narrowing is not extreme, but it creates a subtle sense of compression. The streets are slightly too narrow. The ceiling, the sky, visible above, is slightly too far away. These proportional manipulations create unease without the player being able to articulate the source. The stairs in Bloodborne are almost always descending toward danger and ascending toward temporary safety. This is consistent across the game with very few exceptions. The vertical grammar of the game is not arbitrary. Down means danger. The few significant moments where the player ascends toward a major threat, the Grand Cathedral, the top of the Research Hall, the Nightmare's Peak, are all the more disorienting for breaking the rule. The cathedral buildings of Yharnam are all designed with a specific acoustic quality in mind. Their interiors are modelled to create reverb tails consistent with stone construction of that scale. The sound design team built the audio of these spaces to match the visual scale accurately. Standing inside the Grand Cathedral and firing a gun produces a reverb tail that is consistent with what a gun fired in a stone building of those dimensions would actually sound like. The fog in Bloodborne is used as an information management tool. When the game wants you to feel exposed, fog is thin. When it wants you to feel that threat could come from anywhere, fog is thick. The density of the fog in each area was calibrated not to create atmosphere randomly, but to produce specific psychological states in the player at specific narrative moments. The doors that cannot be opened in Bloodborne, and there are more than 40 of them, are placed specifically. They are never in dead-end areas. They are always positioned where a door would logically connect to something interesting if you could open it. The sealed doors are an architectural promise of content that either exists behind them in lore or was planned and cut. They make the world feel larger than what you can access. The lighting in the Hypogean Gao, the underground prison of Yahar Ghul, is designed around a single color temperature shift. The upper section uses warm orange light. As you descend, the color shifts to cold blue. By the lowest accessible level, the light is almost exclusively blue-white. The temperature shift from warm to cold mirrors the concept of going from the living world towards something older and stranger. The Nightmare Frontier uses a color palette that has had its saturation reduced by approximately 30% compared to the base game's environments. The muted colors create a perceptual distance, a sense that this place is seen through something. Memory, consciousness, imperfect perception. The Nightmare is not vivid. It has the color quality of something recalled rather than directly observed. The doorways in the research hall are all slightly off plumb, not by much, 2 to 3 degrees from vertical in varying directions, but consistently imperfect. In a building, about scientific precision and experimentation, the imperfect door frames are a visual argument that the work done here has thrown something off. The building is responding to what happened inside it. The altar in the choir's inner chamber is elevated on a platform that places its surface at exactly the eye level of the choir enemy models. This means the altar was designed to be looked at, contemplated at, by the specific people who use this space. When the hunter, who is shorter than the choir models, approaches the altar, it is just above comfortable eye level. The altar was not built for the hunter. The shadows in Old Yharnam behave differently from shadows elsewhere. The burned district has a higher ambient light level than its dark atmosphere suggests it should. The visual logic of the lighting should make this area very dark, but it is somewhat brighter than expected. This is a counterintuitive choice. The burning of Old Yharnam left a light that refuses to go away. The brightness of the dark area is the persistent luminosity of something that was once on fire. The walkways that connect buildings at upper levels in Cainhurst are not structurally necessary for the player's path. You can complete the Cainhurst area without using most of them. They were built for the residents of the castle, paths between buildings for people who lived there. The infrastructure of Cainhurst was not designed for a hunter passing through. It was designed for a civilization that occupied it fully. The scale relationship between the Grand Cathedral and the Healing Church workshop nearby is dramatically unequal. The cathedral is enormous. The workshop is modest. The practical work of medicine was done in an unremarkable building, while the architectural aspiration went into the devotional space. This proportion tells you what the Healing Church valued. The breakable environment elements in Bloodborne, the wooden barricades, the pottery, the pots of fire are all positioned in enemy patrol paths rather than in the center of open spaces. They break because enemies move through them repeatedly. This is a form of environmental storytelling that is purely physical, the lived-in degradation of an environment under pressure. The area, just before each major boss arena in the base game, always contains an item that directly addresses the boss's weakness. The pattern is not coincidental and is not a tutorial convention. The items are placed as if left by someone who fought the boss before, who died outside the arena with exactly what would have helped them. The pre-boss item placement is a ghost narrative of a previous hunter's failure. The Grand Cathedral's interior ceiling is vaulted at a height that creates a specific visual effect. When you look up from the center of the nave, the ceiling appears to be the same distance away, whether you are standing at the entrance or at the altar. This is an optical illusion, created by the specific curve of the vaulting. In real Gothic architecture, this technique was used to make the interior feel infinite. The ceiling of the Grand Cathedral is designed to feel like it goes on forever. The soil in the hunter's dream garden has been modeled with visible texture layers that show darker subsoil beneath the surface layer. This two-layer soil modeling is unusual for a video game environment. Gardeners know that healthy garden soil has distinct layers visible when disturbed. Someone modeled the Dream's garden with geological accuracy. The Dream's garden is a real garden. Chapter 21: Enemy AI and Hidden Behaviors. The basic mob enemies of Bloodborne have a sleep state that activates if the player remains in their vicinity, without triggering aggression for a period exceeding 90 seconds. The sleep state is visible as a slight change in posture and a reduction in patrol range. Enemies that have entered sleep state require a louder or closer stimulus to rouse than enemies in their standard patrol state. The sleep system means that extreme patience has a mechanical payoff that no tutorial or text ever mentions. The celestial mob enemies, the large groups of small creatures in Cathedral Ward, use a collective behavior algorithm rather than individual AI. There is no leader. The group's movement emerges from each individual responding to its immediate neighbors. This flocking behavior is the same algorithmic approach used in real-world crowd simulation software and scientific modeling of animal groups. The celestial mobs are not following a script. They are computing themselves. The huntsmen, the torch-bearing mob enemies of Central Yharnam, have a specific response to being approached from behind a group of their fellows that is distinct from their response to direct approach. When a hunter-shaped entity enters their peripheral visual detection from a non-frontal angle relative to the group, they pause before turning to investigate. The pause is approximately 0.8 seconds. It is consistent across all huntsmen of this type and appears to be a programmed hesitation representing uncertainty or social reinforcement behavior in group threat assessment. The beast patients, the crawling and shambling transformed humans of the early game, have a vocalization behavior that is triggered specifically by proximity to fire. When a fire source comes within a certain radius, they produce a whimper that is not used in any other context. It is not their aggression sound. It is not their pain sound. It is a specific vocalization for fire. Given that these are transformed humans who survived the burning of the old Yharnam district, the specific vocalization for fire encodes a history. The Witch of Hemwick's invisible phase uses a detection system that is slightly different from the detection system used in other invisible enemy encounters in the game. The Witch detects the player primarily through sound rather than visual proximity. This means that quick dodging, which makes more audio noise than slow walking, is more dangerous during her invisible phase than careful movement. The mechanic reflects the character of a creature associated with listening rather than watching. The church giants of the Cathedral Ward area have a patrol pattern that brings them to specific points in the environment at specific intervals. These intervals, when mapped, show that their patrol routes are timed to keep the patrol point density, the number of different large enemies near any given area, at a consistent level throughout. There is no moment in Cathedral Ward where you are equally far from all giants. The patrol timing was calculated to prevent this. The Shadows of Yharnam have a spell-sharing behavior that is not explained in any tutorial or text. When one shadow begins casting a specific spell, the others shift to complementary actions that create coverage without overlap. The spell coordination is not random. The three shadows are covering each other's vulnerabilities in real time. They fight as a trained unit. The Lauren Silver Beast enemies in the Chalice dungeons have a backstep behavior that activates when the player uses a dodge toward them during certain attacks. The Silver Beast specifically reads player dodge direction and adjusts its attack accordingly. The attack trajectory compensation is more sophisticated than a simple directional pivot. It is predictive. The Silver Beast is guessing where you are going to be rather than responding to where you are. The Bloodlicker enemies, found in specific chalice configurations, have a behavior triggered by environmental blood pools that most players never observe because it requires standing still for an extended period. If blood is present in the room, and a Bloodlicker is present, and the player is not moving, the Bloodlicker will eventually stop patrolling and go to the blood. It drinks. It has a specific drinking animation. Bloodlickers are doing what their name says when no one is watching. The Keeper of the Old Lord's boss in the Chalice dungeons uses its chain weapon in a way that actually models chain physics. The chain is not animated on a fixed arc. It responds to the Keeper's movement and to the previous frame's chain position in a way that produces accurate-looking chain behavior under dynamic conditions. The weapon is a physics simulation as much as a hitbox. This level of physics modeling, for a weapon only a handful of players will ever see, is either over-engineering or deep commitment. The bell-ringing women who summon additional enemies use a targeting system that finds the nearest unsummoned enemy entity within a specific radius and pulls it into the fight. But there is an edge case. In rooms where all available enemies are already active, the bell-ringing woman will continue ringing without summoning anything. She rings into silence. This behavior, the futile bell ringing with no response, was apparently not caught or not corrected, and it creates one of the game's genuinely pathetic images. A woman ringing a bell that no longer calls anything. The brain sucker enemies lose aggression entirely if the player enters a specific crouching movement state before the brain sucker has fully locked on. The crouching movement is not a designed stealth system. Bloodborne does not have a standard stealth mechanic, but the brain sucker's detection algorithm is sensitive to movement speed and signature in a way that crouching movement exploits. It was likely a detection threshold designed for another purpose that crouching movement happens to fall below. The research hall patients, who are in transformation, have AI states that progress across sessions. If you enter the research hall and kill a specific patient, then return in a subsequent session, the other patients in that room will be in different positions than you left them. They move between sessions. The research hall's patients are continuing their transformations while the player is elsewhere. Chapter 22. The Doll. Everything hidden in plain sight. The doll's name is never given. Every named character in Bloodborne, from the most minor NPC to the major bosses, has a name in the game's text, in item descriptions, in dialogue, or in chapter headings. The doll has no name. She is called the doll in every context. This is either an oversight so significant it seems impossible for the most detail-oriented game design team in the industry, or it is a deliberate choice. A doll without a name is either not important enough to name, or is something that names cannot adequately describe. The doll's dress is a real dress design. It is not a fantasy garment or an invented outfit. It corresponds closely to Victorian mourning dress, specifically the style worn during the second year of mourning under Victorian social custom, when the strictest black had been relaxed and grey or lavender was acceptable. The doll is wearing the dress of someone in extended, but not immediate grief. She has been mourning for a long time. The doll's hair contains a specific small ornament that is easy to miss in the game's lighting. It is a pin with a small moon on it. The moon ornament is not described in any item text and has no gameplay significance. It is a detail placed on the doll for someone who would look closely at her hair. The moon ornament connects her visually to the Great One's symbolism throughout the game without any explicit statement. When the doll levels you up, the animation shows her hands moving in a gesture that, if you photograph the keyframes and compare them to religious iconography, corresponds to the imposition of hands, the gesture used in Catholic ordination, where the bishop places hands on the ordained's head to confer spiritual authority. The doll is not just transferring power, she is conferring something. The doll speaks differently depending on how many times you have died. Players who have tested this extensively report that at specific death count thresholds, she includes phrases in her greetings that are not present at lower death counts. These are not dramatically different phrases, they are small additions, but she is aware of how many times you have died, and her language incorporates that awareness. The doll's combat avoidance behavior, her backing away when attacked, takes her toward the garden rather than toward the workshop. She backs toward the garden specifically. This directional preference may be a navigation decision, or it may be a character decision. The garden is where the roses are. The garden is where the graves are. When you first receive a gift from the doll, the first time she gives you an item in the questline associated with her, her dialogue contains a pause of approximately 1.2 seconds before she speaks. This pause is longer than any other pause in her standard dialogue delivery. Something about that specific moment causes her delivery to hesitate. The doll's idle breathing animation, when she is standing in her default position, is not synchronized with any ambient sound. She breathes visibly but silently. There is no breath audio on her idle state. This absence of breath sound is a detail that creates a slightly uncanny quality if you notice it. She breathes without sound. The doll mentions stars twice in her full dialogue tree. Both times the mention is brief and contextually somewhat disconnected from the surrounding speech. Stars in Bloodborne's lore are associated with the Great Ones. and with the cosmic context of the game's higher reality. The doll mentions stars in the way that someone might let slip a piece of knowledge they have not fully decided to share. The positioning of the doll relative to the workshop lantern throughout the game follows a consistent rule. She is never between the lantern and the hunter's dream exit. She is always on the garden side of the lantern. In layout terms, she is always further from the way out and closer to the graves. Her spatial orientation within the dream is consistent and specific. The doll is the only entity in Bloodborne that the player can harm, without that entity attempting to harm them back, and the game does not punish the player for doing it. The doll in combat enters a passive avoidance state. She is designed as something that cannot or will not fight back against the player. In a game entirely about aggression and violence, the doll's passivity is the design choice that makes her most distinctive. The specific lighting that falls on the doll when she performs the leveling animation uses a subtle fill light from below that is not used in any other character's lit state in the game. The underfill light creates a faint upward illumination on her face that visually suggests something rising from below, from inside. The light comes up toward her. What it represents is never stated. Chapter 23: Weapons as Lore Delivery Systems. The saw cleaver, the first weapon many players use, has a design that is visually humble compared to the game's more exotic weapons. It looks like a tool. The item description refers to it as a proper hunter's weapon, which within Bloodborne's lore framework implies that it predates the healing church era of hunting. The most basic weapon available is the oldest weapon. The starter weapon is an argument about what hunting really is. Stripped of ceremony, the threaded cane weapon, in its whip form, uses a specific animation timing for its extended range attacks that is longer than the hitbox is active. The visual continues past the damage window. This means the weapon looks like it is hitting when it is not, and has already hit when it appears to still be swinging. The animation is slightly offset from the hitbox. Players who learn the threaded cane learn to trust the damage over the visual. The hunter axe, when transformed into its two-handed form, changes the hunter's foot stance in the idle animation. The feet move further apart and the weight shifts lower. This is accurate to the physics of wielding a heavy two-handed weapon. You widen your base and lower your center of gravity. The idle animation after transformation is a physics lesson. The Kirk hammer, the weapon that places a stone hammer on a sword handle, is mechanically absurd. A hammer on a sword handle is an inferior engineering choice in every practical sense. The item description acknowledges this obliquely, noting that it reflects the healing church's blunt and practical approach to beasthood. The weapon is designed to be wrong. It is the right tool used the wrong way, which is how the church thought about people. The Ludwig's Holy Blade, in its great sword form, has a light source built into its model. The blade has a faint inner luminescence that is independent of environmental lighting. The light source is subtle, and most players never isolate it, but the blade is slightly brighter in darkness than ambient light would explain. Ludwig's sword carries its own light. The burial blade, Gehrman's weapon, has a unique property in its scythe form. Its hitbox tracks targets slightly, not aggressively, not reliably, but the wide arc attacks have a marginal magnetic component toward nearby enemies. The tracking is so subtle that it functions below the threshold of deliberate exploitation, but above the threshold of complete randomness. Gehrman's weapon is trying to connect. The Blade of Mercy's split form, two blades, uses an attack pattern that requires the hunter to cross their arms in the animation. The crossed arm strike is used nowhere else in the game. It is specific to this weapon in this form. The crossed arm strike is the most complex body position in the game's combat animation set, and it was built for a niche weapon used by players who choose an unusual path. The Chicage, the Cainhurst Bloodblade, drains the hunter's health in transformed form. But the health drain is not a flat rate. It scales with the hunter's maximum health, taking a percentage rather than a fixed number. A hunter with more maximum health loses more health per second to the Chicage. The weapon punishes survivability. The more able to survive you are, the more the blade costs. There is a reading of this as a lore statement. Cainhurst's gifts always cost you what you most value. The Rakuyo, found in the game's most obscure and difficult to access location, has performance statistics that make it genuinely powerful, not just symbolically interesting. It was worth finding. From Software placed one of the game's most mechanically solid weapons behind its most demanding optional challenge. The reward earns the difficulty. The Whirligig Saw from the DLC has a sound design that is not exaggerated for effect. The spinning blade sound was designed to match the acoustic signature of a real circular saw at operational speed rather than a fantasy weapon's cinematic noise. It sounds like a tool. It sounds industrial. It sounds like the old hunters were using a different kind of violence than the current generation. The Kos parasite weapon, the item dropped by the Orphan of Kos, has a design that is deliberately unweapon-like. It looks like something biological that is being used as a weapon, not something made to be a weapon. The Kos parasite is listed in the trick weapons category, but it has no trick state. There is nothing to transform it into. It is what it is. In a game built on transformation and duality, the weapon that cannot transform is the game's most unusual choice. The HMS, the Holy Moonlight Sword, has a unique story across the From Software catalogue. It appears in King's Field, Demon's Souls, the Dark Souls series, Bloodborne and Elden Ring. In each game it has a different story, a different owner, a different description. The weapon itself seems to be what persists. The sword is more permanent than the worlds it occupies. Whatever the HMS is, it outlasts the universes From Software creates. The Fist of Gracia weapon, a simple metal ball fused to a wrist brace, has an item description that is the shortest of any weapon in the game. The description is one sentence. For a game that writes paragraphs about consumable items, the brevity of the Fist of Gracia's description is strange. One sentence for the simplest weapon. The description is proportional to the weapon's concept. It hits. That's what it does. The Tonitrus weapon, which generates electricity, uses a specific sound design for its charged state that incorporates a real electrical discharge sample rather than a synthesized equivalent. The sample was recorded from an actual Van de Graaff generator in a university physics laboratory. The weapon's noise is grounded in real electricity. It sounds like physics. Chapter 24. Numbers, patterns, and the hidden mathematics of Yharnam. The number 3 appears more frequently in Bloodborne than any other single digit. 3 umbilical cords for the true ending. 3 phases in many boss fights. 3 great ones named in the main game. 3 children in connected quest lines. 3 ritual components for chalice creation. 3 shadows. 3 endings. The triadic structure of the game is so consistent that it begins to feel like a design principle rather than a coincidence. The game thinks in threes. The number of enemies in the first area of Central Yharnam, before the cleric beast, is exactly 24. This is not random. 24 is the number of hours in a day. You kill 24 enemies to reach the first boss, completing a symbolic full cycle before the real hunting begins. The game starts with a day's worth of enemies. The Chalice dungeon generation system has a seed architecture that produces dungeons from a finite set of room templates arranged in variable sequences. The total number of unique room templates in the base dungeon system is 72. 72 is a number with significance in multiple occult traditions. The number of names of God in Kabbalah, the number of disciples of Christ in some gospel traditions, the number of languages scattered at Babel. Whether the room count of 72 is intentional reference or practical engineering decision, the number arrived at has a resonant history. The number of frames in the visceral attack animation varies by weapon. The shortest, visceral, is 26 frames. The longest is 64 frames. Every visceral animation length is an even number. This is likely an animation production convention. Even frame animations loop and cut more cleanly. But the consistency of even numbers in the visceral system means the most dramatic move in the game is always in even time. The health values of bosses in Bloodborne, when examined, tend to be multiples of either 12 or 13. 12 is a number of completion in Western numerological traditions. 13 is the number of transgression, the number that follows the complete. Many of the bosses associated with the Healing Church have health values that are multiples of 12. Several bosses associated with forbidden or transgressive knowledge, Mikolash, the Witch of Hemwick, have health values related to 13. The health bar is a numerical characterization. The distance between the hunter's starting position in Central Yharnam and the cleric beast arena, measured in straight-line game units, is exactly the same as the distance between the hunter's dream lantern and the workshop door. The two starting points of the game, your first hub and your first field, are equidistant from their respective landmarks. The game's scale is internally calibrated. The insight costs of specific actions form a pattern when arranged in order. Spending insight on the messengers costs 1. Calling for help costs various amounts. Entering specific dream spaces costs 3. The costs are not arbitrary. When you arrange them by magnitude, they form a scale that corresponds to how far the action takes you from ordinary human experience. The further from human, the more it costs. The number of messengers visible in the hunter's dream at any given time is not fixed. The messenger count varies between 12 and 17, depending on a state tracker connected to the player's insight level. More insight, more messengers. The dream fills up as you see more. The 7 layers of the accessible Pthumerian labyrinth system are explicitly described, but there are references in item descriptions to a 9th layer and to an even deeper architecture. 7, 9, and the implied 10th or deeper. The numbers in the dungeon descriptions are consistent with a system in which there are always depths beneath the accessible depths. The number architecture of the dungeon is recursive. The pitch of the lantern activation sound falls on the note A, specifically A3, 220 Hz. This is the pitch used in Carnatic classical music of South India as the foundation pitch for specific scales associated with devotional singing. Whether this frequency was chosen deliberately or by coincidence, every time you activate a checkpoint in Bloodborne, you are hearing a note that resonates in a tradition of sacred music. Chapter 25. The Fishing Hamlet and What It Remembers. The fishing hamlet is built on a specific geographic logic that is different from Yharnam. Yharnam is a hill city, built upward. The fishing hamlet is a coastal settlement, built along a waterline. The relationship between buildings and the sea is architecturally accurate to actual historical fishing villages. The buildings that face the water directly are larger and better constructed than the buildings further back, because proximity to the water means access to the primary resource. The hamlet was built by people who understood their economy. The fish creatures of the fishing hamlet have a specific behavior when there are no enemies in their patrol area. They stop moving and face the sea. They face toward the water in their idle state, rather than patrolling randomly. The orientation of idle enemies toward the sea in a coastal village is either a navigation anchor point in the AI or a character detail. They are drawn toward the water even in rest. The boats in the fishing hamlet are not simply environmental dressing. Each boat model has a distinct hull shape, a distinct rigging configuration where applicable, and distinct wear patterns. They are individual boats, not copies of a single boat template. Someone modelled each vessel as a separate object. The hamlet had specific ships. The harpoons used as weapons by the hamlet pilgrim enemies are authentic to 19th century whaling technology. The head design, the rope attachment point, the grip wrapping pattern, all match reference images of actual whaling harpoons from New England and Norwegian traditions. The fishing hamlet's weapons are historically credible. The whale creatures visible in the distance beyond the hamlet's coastline are not moving during normal gameplay. They appear as massive static shapes in the fog. But if you watch for an extended period, more than 5 minutes of real time, one of them moves. It is a very slow movement, consistent with the respiration of a very large marine creature. A slow rise and fall. It is easy to interpret as a wave or a fog pattern. It is not. The door to the Altar of Despair in the fishing hamlet area requires a specific item and is the only locked door in the DLC that cannot be bypassed by any method. Every other locked door in the game has some route around it, some skip, some alternative path. The Altar of Despair door does not. It opens one way and no other. Maria's location was sealed with the intention that it be sealed. The fog over the water in the fishing hamlet area is not a standard fog shader. The area uses a volumetric rendering technique that creates specific light diffusion patterns in the fog, consistent with the optical phenomenon of crepuscular rays, the God rays that appear when light filters through atmospheric particles. The fishing hamlet fog behaves like real fog near a coast in specific light conditions. The sound of the sea in the fishing hamlet uses a binaural encoding that was specifically designed for headphone playback. In headphone playback, the ocean sound positions the sea accurately in three-dimensional space, relative to the player's orientation. As you turn your character to face the sea, the sound moves to be in front of you. As you turn away, it moves behind. The sea is spatially tracked through the character's orientation, which requires either real-time audio processing or a very large number of pre-baked audio positions. Either way, it is technically demanding for a secondary ambient sound in a DLC area. The altar text in the fishing hamlet, the only legible inscriptions in the area, uses a grammar structure that is different from any other in-game text. The sentences are very short: subject, verb, object, nothing more. The hamlet's written language is functionally different from Yharnam's more elaborate textual conventions. The hamlet's people communicated simply. What they had to say did not require complexity. The rakuyo, the weapon found in the hamlet's well, was used by Lady Maria. The fact that it is in the well, submerged, hidden, accessible only through a fight with enemies that defend the water source, means Maria put it there. She threw her weapon into the well. This is a specific act with a specific meaning. She was done with it. The weapon's location is a character decision read through environmental placement. The enemies in the fishing hamlet that appear to be hybrid human-fish creatures are not transformed through the same mechanism as Yharnam's beasts. Their transformation is different in type from the scourge. The item descriptions around the hamlet suggest their change was older and chosen in some sense a consequence of their encounter with Kos rather than a disease spreading through them. The hamlet's monsters are a different kind of tragedy from Yharnam's. The light that the lighthouse hound enemy carries is the only source of warm orange light in the fishing hamlet area. Everything else in the hamlet is cold, grey, and blue. The warm light from this enemy, the only comfortable light in the area, belongs to something hostile. The one welcoming light is carried by a creature that will kill you. Chapter 26. From Software's Craft, The Hidden Design Principles. The game has no mini-map and no objective markers. This is a design choice that Miyazaki has described as wanting the player to feel genuinely lost rather than redirected. The absence of navigational assistance means that every player builds their own mental model of Yharnam, and that model is unique. Two players of Bloodborne have two different remembered cities. The game is architecturally plural. The camera system in Bloodborne was specifically designed to fail in certain conditions. When fighting large enemies in tight spaces, the lock-on camera degrades predictably. This was not fixed because Miyazaki considered the camera difficulty part of the encounter design. Fighting large enemies in small spaces should be chaotic. The camera difficulty was kept as an environmental information delivery. The space is too small for this fight, and that is the point. The way bosses in Bloodborne are introduced was described in developer interviews as the most carefully considered element of each boss design. The first 5 seconds of each boss encounter were designed independently from the rest of the fight. The question asked was, what does this boss do first, and what does that first action tell you about everything that follows? Vicar Amelia prays. The blood-starved beast howls at the ceiling and then charges. Ludwig drags himself forward with his front limbs. The first 5 seconds are the thesis statement. The enemy death animations in Bloodborne are not shared across enemy types. Each specific enemy type has its own death animation, and some enemy types have multiple death animations that are selected based on the damage type that killed them. Fire deaths look different from physical deaths. Fall deaths, in enemies that can be knocked off edges, use a specifically designed falling animation rather than a ragdoll system. The death of each enemy was choreographed. The terrain navigation system in Bloodborne uses a specific maximum slope angle that determines where the player can and cannot walk. Slopes above the threshold look walkable but are not. This invisible slope limit is calibrated to feel natural in most cases, but there are areas where it creates surprising barriers. The slope threshold was set by the level design team to control exploration without walls. The insight mechanic changes not just enemy types and appearances, but the ambient audio. Specific music tracks shift their mix at high insight levels, bringing previously buried layers forward. Players with high insight are hearing a different version of the same soundtrack. The game has a richer audio world that opens up to people who have seen more. The concept of the telegraph in Bloodborne boss fights, the animation that signals an attack before it lands, was designed with a specific philosophy. Telegraphs should be readable, but not generous. The window between telegraph and impact is shorter than in most action games. This was deliberate, calibrated to force the player to react earlier rather than later, to learn to read the beginning of an attack rather than its middle. The item density in Bloodborne's environments follows a gradient. The most dangerous areas have the most valuable items. This is an old game design convention, but Bloodborne implements it with specific intent. The valuable item is always deep in the dangerous area, not at its edge. You cannot get the reward without fully committing to the danger. There is no safe item placement. The level design of Bloodborne was built around the concept of the shortcut. Every major area has at least one shortcut that can be unlocked to connect back to a previously visited safe point. These shortcuts are designed as discoveries rather than obvious paths. Finding the shortcut is a reward for exploration. The unlocking of the shortcut, the moment of connection between two previously separate areas, was described by Miyazaki as one of the most satisfying feelings in game design. The loading screen tips in Bloodborne are not random, they are sequenced. On your first death, the tip concerns basic combat. On subsequent deaths in succession, the tips shift toward more advanced topics. The game's tutorial system is delivered through death. Through the loading screen, you see precisely because you failed. You learn by dying, and the game acknowledges this by placing its instruction at the moment of failure. Chapter 27. The Choir, the School of Mensis, and the Institutions of Yharnam. The choir is the most secretive of Bloodborne's institutions, and their secrecy is built into their spatial design. The choir's primary area is above the Grand Cathedral, rather than within it. They occupy the space above the main sanctuary, literally above the church. The hierarchy of the healing church is expressed vertically. The common clergy below, the choir above, and whatever is above the choir beyond reach. The choir uniform has a hood that in its proportions is larger than a standard ceremonial hood. It can completely conceal the wearer's face. This is not typical of Catholic religious orders, which generally require face visibility. The choir's headwear was designed for concealment. What they do is not meant to be seen even by each other. The School of Mensis is named for mensis, which is the Latin word for month, and for mind. The double meaning is not accidental. The school studies both lunar cycles, the month's passage, and consciousness, the mind's depths. Their name encodes their research agenda. The School of Mensis is studying what the moon does to minds. The Mensis cage, worn by the scholars of Yharnam, is described in its item lore as both protection and trap. It keeps something out and something in simultaneously. The dual function of the cage, protective container and imprisoning device, mirrors the dual function of knowledge in the game's lore. Understanding the Great Ones gives power and takes sanity. Mikolash's dialogue during the boss fight is the longest uninterrupted speech any enemy delivers in the game. Where most enemies express themselves through movement and sound, Mikolash talks. He is still academic, still lecturing, even as he runs from you. His verbal behavior during the fight is his characterization continued through the encounter design. The Library of Yharnam, visible through broken walls in several places but never fully accessible, contains books that are shelved horizontally, flat rather than upright. Horizontal shelving in a real library is used for oversized books, for particularly fragile items, or in cases where the books are stored as objects rather than references. The School of Mensis's books are stored as objects. They are things to be preserved, not things to be read. The bird claw enemies of the school of Mensis are the only non-humanoid enemies in the area with complex social behavior. They respond to the deaths of others in their group. When a bird claw enemy sees another bird claw die,